In the autumn silence of early America, the night was more than just the absence of light. It was a territory of its own, thick with uncertainty, filled with noises that had no easy explanation. Before electricity, before cars and highways, when the woods pressed close against the small villages and the moon was the only lamp for miles, darkness was not a background. It was an active presence. The settlers who lived along the Hudson River knew this well. They built their homes near each other for safety. They locked their shutters against the cold wind, and they carried lanterns that seemed pitifully small compared to the vastness of the night. For them, stories were not idle entertainment. They were warnings. They were explanations for sounds in the forest, shadows in the mist, and riders who might appear suddenly on the road. Among these stories, none grew more powerful than the one of the horseman who came without a head. It is difficult now to imagine the sheer weight of silence in those rural places. A man walking home after sunset might hear the crunch of leaves, the sudden crack of a branch, or the echo of hooves that came from no visible rider. When fear takes hold, every sound becomes sharper, every shadow a threat. In this environment, the tale of a phantom horseman struck deeply because it reflected not only a fear of the dark, but also a fear of the unknown carried across the ocean.
The people who settled in New York's Hudson Valley brought with them fragments of European folklore, ghost stories, and omens, and these pieces fused with the new anxieties of a country still haunted by war. Out of this mixture, the legend took root. The image itself is as impossible as it is unforgettable. A tall rider clad in dark clothing, mounted on a massive steed, his shoulders ending not in a head, but in empty space, sometimes carrying the missing head beneath his arm, sometimes replaced with a glowing object, most famously a carved pumpkin. To see such a figure in the flickering light of a lantern was to be confronted with a vision that broke all natural law. The head is not only a body part, it is the seat of identity, reason, speech, and recognition. To encounter a being without one is to face something that should not exist. The absence becomes more terrifying than any monstrous presence. This is why the Headless Horseman endures. He is not just a ghost, he is a walking impossibility. The communities of the Hudson Valley lived with ghosts of a different kind as well. The American Revolution had ended only a few decades before Washington Irving first wrote down his story, but its scars were still fresh. Soldiers who had died violently on the battlefield were remembered in hushed tones. The ground itself was still imagined as restless, holding the remains of men who had fallen in sudden chaotic violence. In the folklore of the valley, it was said that some soldiers could not rest, especially those who had died without proper burial. A Hessian mercenary who had his head taken by a cannonball was exactly the kind of restless spirit people could believe in. He was a reminder of war's brutality, a reminder that the past was not yet at peace. Fear of the rider did not only belong to ghost stories told by candlelight, it shaped the way people thought about their environment. Roads at night were avoided. Travel after sundown was considered risky, not only because of wild animals and thieves, but because of the chance of encountering something that did not belong to the world of the living. When someone heard hooves behind them on a deserted road, the natural instinct was to quicken the pace, to pray, or to make the sign of the cross. The fear was not just of death, but of pursuit. The idea that something faster than you, something relentless, could ride after you in the darkness was enough to keep grown men trembling in their beds. Irving did not invent this terror from nothing. He gave it form and permanence in literature, but the legend already circulated among the people of Sleepy Hollow. Oral tradition was powerful in those small towns, and stories carried from family to family with the weight of truth. Once a figure is said to ride the woods at night, every unexplained sound becomes evidence. A neighbor hears galloping when no horse is seen. A farmer finds his animals restless without cause. A traveler comes home pale and sweating, claiming he was followed by something on the road. These fragments collect, and soon the legend takes on a life of its own. The Headless Horseman is not the first of his kind. The concept of a headless rider had long existed in Europe, and settlers brought those tales with them. But the American version gained its own personality because of its setting and its time. This was not the ancient countryside of Ireland or Germany, but the young, nervous land of a new nation, a land where colonial villages sat on the edge of vast forests. The Hudson River Valley was a liminal place, a borderland between civilization and wilderness, between memory and invention. Here, the figure of the horseman was not only believable, but necessary. He embodied the anxiety of a people trying to make sense of a land both familiar and foreign. Descriptions of the rider vary. In some retellings, his horse is a monstrous black stallion, eyes glowing like embers, nostrils breathing smoke as if from a forge. In others, the horse is simply massive, an unnaturally fast beast whose hooves strike sparks from the stones. The rider himself is most often dressed in dark military clothing, a remnant of his supposed origin as a Hessian soldier. The missing head sometimes appears carried under the arm, eyes still rolling, mouth still grinning, and other times it is replaced entirely with a jack-o'-lantern, that strange American object carved from the harvest's fruit, its hollow grin mocking the living. In every version, the rider is silent. No voice emerges, no command is shouted, only the pounding of hooves and the whistle of air as he raises his weapon. Weapons themselves carry their own symbolism. A sword or axe in the hands of a ghost suggests unfinished violence, the continuation of battle even after death. But the pumpkin, the most enduring image, is stranger still. A vegetable turned into a head, lit from within by fire, it is both comical and horrifying. Its grin is not human, yet it stands in for the most human of features. To see such a thing flying through the night sky toward you is to witness absurdity turned lethal. That may be why the image stuck so firmly in American memory. It was not simply frightening, it was uncanny, both familiar and alien. Children growing up in the valley would hear these tales long before Irving wrote them. A parent might warn a child not to wander too far into the woods at dusk, because the horseman rides after sunset. A group of neighbors might whisper about hearing hooves when no one was supposed to be on the road. Over time, these warnings became part of the local identity. Sleepy Hollow was known as a place touched by the supernatural. Travelers passed through with a sense of dread, expecting something strange to happen. And when Irving finally captured the legend in his tale, he was not inventing out of whole cloth. He was distilling generations of whispered fears into a story that could reach beyond the valley and enter the bloodstream of American folklore. The legend's strength lies not only in the terrifying image, but in the questions it refuses to answer. Why does the horseman ride? Is he searching for his lost head, doomed to wander until it is returned? Is he a hunter of souls, chasing the living as punishment for trespassing on ground soaked with war? Or is he a simple revenant, a soldier denied rest, repeating endlessly the ride he took in life? Each interpretation carries weight, and each one deepens the sense of unease. Because the figure has no head, he has no face to read, no voice to explain himself. His motives remain hidden. This silence is part of his power. He is a story that cannot be explained away, only experienced in fear. As the 19th century unfolded, America changed rapidly, but the horseman remained. In towns that grew into cities, people might laugh at rural superstitions, but they still recognized the power of the tale. The image of the rider galloping through the mist remained compelling, and in a young country hungry for its own myths, it provided a uniquely American monster. Not borrowed whole from Europe, but reshaped and localized, the Headless Horseman became a figure that belonged to the New World. He was a ghost, not of medieval castles or ancient ruins, but of small colonial villages and wooded paths. This gave him a different kind of intimacy. He was not far away. He was close at hand, just beyond the edge of the firelight. The tale begins then, not only with Irving's pen, but with the lived fears of the people. The rider in the dark was their neighbor's rumor, their own nervous glance over the shoulder, their explanation for the unexplainable. He is America's nightmare because he was born directly out of American soil, watered by blood spilled in war, and grown in the anxious nights of the frontier. And once he appeared, he never left the saddle. The Valley of the Hudson has always been a place where the line between reality and imagination blurs. Rolling hills descend into marshes thick with fog, the river widens and narrows like a living thing, and the forests rise dense and shadowed, pressing against the fields and farms. It is a land of sudden contrasts. One moment the path opens to a bright meadow dotted with wildflowers, and the next it plunges into a ravine where sunlight barely reaches and the trees form a ceiling of twisted branches. For the people who lived there in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the geography itself encouraged stories. To walk through Sleepy Hollow at twilight was to step into a world that seemed designed to unsettle the mind. Travelers wrote of the strange stillness that fell over the place. Even when the wind swept through the valley, it seemed muted, muffled, as if the air itself were holding its breath. Birds quieted, animals kept to the underbrush, and the human voice felt oddly small. Sleepy Hollow was not merely quiet, it was heavy with a presence. Washington Irving, when he wrote his tale, called it a place where some spell seemed to hang over the land, and his phrasing was no exaggeration. The landscape itself encouraged belief that supernatural forces lingered there. The mist rising from the marshes at dawn curled like phantom smoke. The old Dutch burial ground lay shaded by ancient trees, and the crooked roads wound through groves that seemed to belong to another time altogether. The people of the Hollow carried a strong sense of the past with them. Their settlement was one of the oldest in the region, originally founded by the Dutch long before the English or the Americans took control. Many of the families still spoke Dutch at home, still followed traditions that traced back across the Atlantic. In the old stone churchyard, the graves dated back more than a century, some marked with carved winged skulls that reminded every passerby of mortality. The church itself, simple and sturdy, stood as a reminder that life in the valley had always been precarious. Disease, accidents, and raids from earlier conflicts had taken many lives, and the land seemed to hold those memories in silence. To live in Sleepy Hollow was to live alongside the dead. The burial ground, in particular, became the center of ghostly speculation. It was said that strange lights flickered there at night, that figures were seen moving between the stones, and that shadows stretched longer than they should have. In communities where faith and superstition mixed freely, the churchyard was more than a resting place. It was a threshold. And when stories of the Headless Horseman grew, it was here that he was most often said to be seen. The tale insisted he was buried there, that his restless spirit galloped forth from the earth itself in search of his missing head. This rooted the legend not in some distant battlefield, but in the very soil of the community. Every villager who passed the churchyard after dark knew they were walking over the same ground from which the horseman might rise. The geography of Sleepy Hollow also offered natural stages for terror. One of the most famous was the bridge near the old mill. Spanning the dark waters of a narrow stream, it stood as the final test in Irving's tale, the place where Ichabod Crane's desperate ride came to its climax. Bridges themselves have always been places of symbolism in folklore. They are crossings, thresholds between one place and another, and often between the natural and supernatural. To run across that bridge in the dark with hooves pounding behind you was to gamble on escape. The villagers said the horseman's power ended at the bridge, that he could not cross it, and so it became the one place where safety might be found. But to reach it, you had to ride the long, twisting path through the woods, where shadows leaned close, and every tree seemed to hide an enemy. The hollow earned its name not only from its geography,
but from the sensation it inspired. Sleepy did not mean peaceful, it meant enchanted, half asleep, caught between waking and dreaming.
Visitors often remarked that the place seemed to dull the senses, to weigh on the mind, until one could hardly tell whether what they saw was real or imagined. A trick of the mist might seem like a figure. A branch cracking in the woods might become the echo of a pursuing horse. This atmosphere made the legend thrive because it encouraged people to doubt their own perception. When you are never certain whether what you see is real, you become open to the possibility of the impossible. Irving drew heavily from this atmosphere when he wrote. He described how even the most skeptical visitor soon felt the mood of the place, how the villagers were particularly susceptible to tales of ghosts and spirits. The legend of the horseman was only the most famous among many. There were whispers of women who had died tragically appearing on the roads, of spectral lights leading travelers astray, of mysterious voices calling from the marshes. The hollow was alive with ghost stories because the land itself seemed to invite them. A man walking home alone after dusk might convince himself he saw a rider when it was only mist. But once he believed, the story grew, and soon others confirmed it. Sleepy Hollow was a community that breathed in superstition and breathed out legends. The forests surrounding the valley played their own part. In daylight, they were merely woods, with oaks and maples rising high, but at night they became walls of darkness. Paths narrowed until they seemed to close in on the traveler. Roots caught at boots, branches scraped at shoulders, and the silence pressed in so heavily that the sound of one's own breath felt like a shout. It was here, in these woods, that the horseman was most often said to ride. Not out in the open fields where one might see him coming from a distance, but in the narrow lanes where escape was nearly impossible. The claustrophobia of the forest, combined with the pounding fear of being pursued, made the story all the more believable. Villagers described the hollow as a place where time seemed to slow. Days dragged, nights lingered. This suspension of ordinary rhythm made supernatural encounters feel more plausible. If time itself could stretch or collapse in the hollow, then why not the boundaries between the living and the dead? Irving leaned on this quality in his tale, creating a setting where Ichabod's frantic flight felt both eternal and instantaneous. The geography was not merely backdrop, it was an active force shaping the events. The cultural landscape mattered just as much as the physical one. The valley's Dutch heritage carried with it old-world beliefs about spirits, omens, and the thin veil between life and death. These beliefs merged with the anxieties of a new American society still defining itself. The result was a place where superstition was not mocked but accepted as part of life. To scoff at ghost stories was to invite misfortune. Better to show respect to the unseen, to carry a charm, to avoid the churchyard after sunset. This mindset gave fertile soil for the horseman to thrive. He was not just a story, he was a neighbor, an unseen presence accepted as part of the community. The hollow's reputation spread. Travelers who passed through told of the strange atmosphere, of hearing stories from locals who swore by them. The tale of the horseman left the valley, but carried with it the weight of a specific geography. Even when retold elsewhere, the setting was always Sleepy Hollow. The name itself became synonymous with ghostly dread. Other towns had their stories, but Sleepy Hollow had the rider, and that association never faded. Irving immortalized the landscape in his tale, but he did not exaggerate when he described its qualities. The mist, the burial ground, the bridge, the silence, all were real features that lent themselves naturally to superstition. The story and the land reinforced each other. The land made the story believable, and the story gave the land its aura of enchantment. To this day, visitors to Sleepy Hollow remark on its atmosphere, on the way the air seems thicker, the shadows deeper, as if the old tales still hang over the valley. What makes the haunted landscape so important is that it grounds the impossible in the possible. A headless rider may stretch belief, but when he is said to appear at a specific bridge, to ride from a specific graveyard, to gallop along roads you yourself have walked, the legend becomes harder to dismiss. The Hollow turned a ghost story into local reality. It gave the rider a home, a terrain to command, a stage on which his terrifying drama could unfold night after night. And so, the legend grew not only from fear of death or from European tales carried across the ocean, but from the soil, the trees, and the river of a very real place. Sleepy Hollow was not just a backdrop, it was the cradle of the nightmare, the haunted valley that made the horseman believable. To understand the rider, one must first understand the land that gave him life. When the legend of the Headless Horseman passed from whispered tale into the pages of literature, it did so through the hand of a man who had already begun shaping the voice of American storytelling. Washington Irving was not a soldier, not a frontier explorer, not even a man of the wilderness. He was a writer who loved to wander, a man fascinated by history, folklore, and the power of place. His genius was not in inventing from nothing, but in listening carefully to the stories around him, polishing them, and presenting them in a way that gave them permanence. With the tale of Sleepy Hollow, he did more than record a ghost story. He created one of the first great American myths. Irving was born in New York City in 1783, the year the Revolutionary War officially ended. His parents named him after George Washington, the celebrated general who had just secured American independence. It was as if from the beginning his life was tied to the larger story of the new nation. As he grew, the young republic was defining itself, searching for its voice, its heroes, and its identity. Literature was still dominated by Europe, especially Britain. Americans read British novels, British poetry, British histories. What Irving would eventually do was give the United States something it desperately lacked, stories rooted in its own soil, its own people, and its own haunted landscapes. From an early age, Irving showed a fascination with storytelling. He sketched, he scribbled, he listened to the elders around him. He wandered through the Hudson Valley and absorbed its atmosphere. He was particularly drawn to places steeped in history. Old churches, colonial houses, graveyards, ruins. These were not relics to him, but sources of imagination. Unlike many of his contemporaries who focused on politics, law, or commerce, Irving looked backward into the past and outward toward legend. He believed America needed folklore just as much as it needed laws and armies. A nation without stories was incomplete. By the time he wrote The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, Irving had already begun to establish himself as a writer of wit and satire. His A History of New York, published under the pseudonym Diedrich Knickerbocker, blended fact and fiction in a humorous way that delighted readers. But in his sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon Gent, published in 1819 to 1820, he found his lasting voice. This collection included not only Sleepy Hollow, but also Rip Van Winkle, another tale rooted in the Hudson Valley. Together, these stories did what no political speech could do. They gave America a cultural identity, a sense of mythic past, even if it was partly invented. Irving did not simply record ghost stories as he heard them. He reimagined them, shaping them with the tools of a skilled storyteller. In the case of Sleepy Hollow, he combined fragments of local folklore with European motifs and infused them with his own narrative style. The result was a story that felt authentic to the valley, but also universal in its themes. He gave the horseman a specific origin, tying him to the Revolutionary War as a Hessian soldier decapitated by a cannonball. This detail rooted the phantom in American soil, connecting the ghost to the nation's bloody birth. At the same time, the headless rider motif was old, stretching back to Ireland's Dullahan and Germany's wild huntsman. Irving's genius was infusing the old world and the new, creating something that felt at once ancient and uniquely American. The story itself is deceptively simple. Ichabod Crane, the lanky schoolteacher, comes to Sleepy Hollow, courts the wealthy Katrina Van Tassel, and finds himself rivaled by the boisterous Brom Bones. On a fateful night, Ichabod encounters, or believes he encounters, the Headless Horseman, and his terrified flight ends with a shattered pumpkin and his disappearance. But beneath the surface, Irving layered meaning. The tale is both comedy and horror, both folklore and satire. Ichabod is at once a sympathetic outsider and a figure of ridicule. The horseman may be a supernatural terror or a prank by Brom Bones. The ambiguity is deliberate. By refusing to confirm whether the ghost is real, Irving left the story balanced between belief and skepticism, just as the hollow itself balanced between waking and dreaming. The success of the story lay partly in its characters. Ichabod Crane was not a noble hero, but a flawed, comical man, more concerned with food and fortune than with courage. Brom Bones was a rough country rival, full of vitality and mischief. Katrina was a prize to be won, a wealthy heiress courted by many. These characters gave readers familiar human drama, rivalry, ambition, courtship. Into this ordinary framework, Irving inserted the extraordinary figure of the horseman. The contrast made the terror sharper. Readers laughed at Ichabod's greed and awkwardness, then shuddered as he galloped through the woods pursued by a headless phantom. It was the blending of comedy and horror that gave the tale its enduring charm. Irving's decision to frame the story as something overheard from locals, passed along by storytellers, also gave it credibility. He did not present it as pure invention, but as a tale rooted in oral tradition. He wrote of how the villagers told it, how each person had their own version, how the legend was part of the very identity of Sleepy Hollow. This technique made readers feel they were encountering folklore, not just fiction. It blurred the line between story and history, allowing the horseman to slip from the page into the cultural imagination. The context in which Irving wrote also mattered. The young United States was hungry for myths. Europe had its ancient castles, its medieval ballads, its pantheon of folklore figures. America, by contrast, was still new, still raw. The Revolution had given it heroes like Washington and Franklin, but it lacked the deep well of stories that gave older nations their cultural richness. By creating tales rooted in the Hudson Valley, Irving gave America a sense of antiquity it did not truly have. His stories suggested that even here, in the New World, the land was already haunted, already filled with echoes of the past. In doing so, Irving also established a pattern for American literature. Writers after him would draw on local settings, on folklore, on the strange and unsettling aspects of American life to create works that felt distinct from European tradition. Edgar Allan Poe would explore the Gothic and the psychological. Nathaniel Hawthorne would turn to Puritan history and its shadows, but it was Irving who showed that the soil of America could sustain myth. The horseman was proof. What made Irving's version of the horseman so enduring was the way he tied him to history. By making him a Hessian soldier, he linked the ghost to the revolution, to the violence and chaos that were still within living memory when he wrote. This gave the phantom a specificity, a reason for his restlessness. He was not just any ghost. He was a casualty of war, a reminder that the birth of the nation was paid for in blood. The image of a soldier searching for his lost head resonated with readers who had fathers, brothers, and uncles who had fought in the war. It was a personal connection between myth and memory. At the same time, Irving's horseman was not simply tragic, he was terrifying. His pursuit of Ichabod was relentless, silent, inevitable. The ambiguity of whether he was real or a trick only heightened the fear. If he was real, then the supernatural had broken into the everyday. If he was a trick, then human malice could produce the same terror as a ghost. Either way, the lesson was the same. The night roads of Sleepy Hollow were not safe. Irving himself became something of a legend in his own right. He was the first American writer to achieve international fame, celebrated both in Europe and at home. His stories helped establish the possibility of American literature as something respected in its own right, not merely a provincial echo of British works. And at the heart of that achievement was The Horseman. The tale proved that an American ghost could be as haunting, as memorable, and as powerful as any European spectre. Over time, the story slipped free of Irving's control. People retold it in their own words. Illustrators depicted the chase in woodcuts and paintings. Stage adaptations appeared. The Horseman became part of the national imagination, no longer just Irving's creation, but America's. The writer had given the Phantom a home in print, but the culture gave him life beyond the page. This was the true birth of the American myth. A figure drawn from fragments of European folklore, rooted in the soil of the Hudson Valley, framed by the pen of a writer who understood the hunger of his nation for legends. The Headless Horseman was not just a character in a story. He became a symbol of what American storytelling could do: take the raw material of the land, the history, the fears of the people, and shape them into something lasting. He was the rider in the dark, and thanks to Irving, he would never ride alone again. The Headless Horseman did not first appear on the banks of the Hudson River, nor was he born entirely from Washington Irving's imagination. The image of a rider without a head is one of the oldest and most unsettling figures in European folklore, a phantom that haunted roads, crossroads, and battlefields long before America became a nation. To trace the horseman's true origins, one has to step back into the landscapes of Ireland, Germany, and Scandinavia, where travelers spoke of ghostly riders who pursued the living and heralded death. Irving's Horseman is a distinctly American version, but his roots reach back to the Old World, where the headless were seen as omens and punishments, figures of divine or demonic judgment. In Ireland, the most famous of these figures was the Dullahan, a headless rider feared for centuries. The Dullahan was said to ride a massive black horse whose hooves sparked fire as they struck the ground. The rider carried his own head under his arm, a hideous object with eyes that rolled back and forth, able to see across great distances, and a mouth that twisted into a demonic grin. In some stories, the head glowed like rotten cheese in the dark, its flesh the color of mold, its teeth gleaming as if freshly sharpened. When the Dullahan rode, doors locked themselves, lamps flickered out, and dogs howled in terror. He was not a wandering ghost in search of his lost head. He was a deliberate hunter, a harbinger of death. The Irish believed that when the Dullahan stopped riding, someone nearby was about to die. He would call out a name, and the soul of that person would be torn from their body. His weapon was a whip made from a human spine, which he cracked at those who tried to block his path. No barrier could stop him. Gates and doors opened of their own accord when he approached. The only defense was gold, a metal he feared, and those who carried it might escape his wrath. But for most, an encounter with the Dullahan was a death sentence. He was not a ghost to be pitied or reasoned with. He was the embodiment of mortality, riding through the night to remind all who heard his hooves that no one could outrun death forever. The Dullahan's legend struck at the heart of human fear. He represented the inevitability of death, but also its violence and suddenness. Unlike peaceful spirits or ancestral ghosts, he did not linger quietly in the background. He pursued, he hunted, he announced. In this, he provided a clear ancestor to the American horseman. The idea of a relentless rider whose approach meant doom was carried across the ocean by Irish immigrants who brought their superstitions with them. Even if Irving himself drew more directly from German stories, the Irish tradition of the headless deathbringer formed part of the larger European current that flowed into Sleepy Hollow. Germany, too, was filled with tales of headless riders.
some of which bear even closer resemblance to Irving's phantom. The Germans spoke of the Wiedergänger, revenants who returned from the grave to ride along familiar roads. In certain regions, it was said that a headless horseman would appear near forests and battlefields, sometimes carrying his severed head, sometimes entirely without one. Unlike the Dullahan, these German riders were often described as former soldiers or hunters, cursed to wander because of some sin in life. Their punishment was eternal riding, restless and unending. They did not always herald death for others, but they spread fear and disorder wherever they went. One particular German tradition, especially strong in the Rhineland, told of the wilde Jäger, the wild huntsman, who led a spectral hunt across the skies on stormy nights. Sometimes he was headless, sometimes his hunters were, but always the image was of a terrifying, unstoppable force riding through the world of the living. The wild hunt itself was a widespread myth across northern Europe, known in Scandinavia, Germany, and even parts of France. It was a vision of ghostly riders sweeping through the night sky, a dangerous encounter for anyone unlucky enough to witness it. Some said the wild hunt carried the souls of the dead. Others said it was a divine army, a punishment for the wicked, or a sign of coming war. The headless figure fit naturally into this myth. To lose one's head was to lose identity, speech, and humanity. A headless rider among the wild hunt was a soul stripped of individuality, reduced to pure terror. When such tales came to America with German immigrants, they merged easily with the anxieties of a young nation still haunted by war. A headless Hessian soldier was, in many ways, simply the American echo of the European rider, given a new uniform and a new battlefield. In Denmark and Sweden, similar stories were told. The Danes spoke of a headless man who rode the countryside as a warning spirit, often near churches or cemeteries. In some accounts, he carried his head under his arm. In others, he had no head at all and rode silently, his presence enough to terrify those who saw him. The Swedes had tales of headless horsemen who were the ghosts of murdered men, doomed to ride until their deaths were avenged. These northern legends emphasized the restless quality of such spirits. They were not at peace. They were bound to the world by unfinished business or curses, their endless riding a punishment or a penance. Even in Britain, fragments of the motif appear. In parts of Scotland, headless apparitions were said to haunt crossroads, sometimes on horseback. English ghost lore included tales of spectral riders without heads, often tied to stories of execution or betrayal. The headless figure was a common motif because it struck at something universal. To lose one's head was the ultimate violation. It left the body incomplete, grotesque, uncanny. A headless rider amplified that horror by placing the impossible figure in motion, pursuing the living, reminding them of the fragility of their own bodies. What unites these European traditions is the sense of the headless rider as a boundary figure. He is neither fully alive nor fully dead. He exists between worlds, riding the roads of the living, but belonging to the realm of the dead. His presence unsettles the order of things. Roads are supposed to be safe passages connecting village to village, farm to market. The headless rider turns the road into a place of fear, a stage for encounters with mortality. Travelers cannot trust that the path will carry them safely. At any moment, a phantom may ride out of the dark, and all human defenses, gates, prayers, weapons will fail. When European immigrants came to America, they carried these fears with them. The forests of the New World were vast and unknown, the nights long and dark. It was easy for Old World stories to take root. A figure like the Headless Horseman did not need to be explained to those who had grown up with tales of the Dullahan or the Wild Huntsman. He was already familiar, already feared. What Irving did was to adapt him, to give him a distinctly American context, but the deep roots of the image lay in Europe, where for centuries the headless had ridden through legend and nightmare. It is important to note that headlessness itself had symbolic power across cultures. In medieval Europe, decapitation was both a punishment and a dishonor. To lose one's head was to lose not just life, but dignity. Executed criminals were often beheaded, their heads displayed as warnings. In battle, decapitation was a brutal but not uncommon fate. A headless ghost, then, embodied shame, violence, and restless spirit. He could not speak because he had no mouth. He could not see because he had no eyes. Yet in legend he often could do both, in exaggerated and terrifying form. His head, when carried, had supernatural sight. His mouth grinned in death. The contradiction only deepened the horror. In Catholic regions of Europe, some believed the headless rider was a soul denied burial rites, a punishment for impiety. In Protestant regions, he might be seen as a demon or a symbol of divine wrath. Either way, the figure represented disruption, a break in the natural order of life and death. His riding was endless because his rest was impossible. And for those who saw him, his presence was a reminder that the boundary between worlds was thin, that death could break into life at any moment. By the time Irving wrote, these traditions had centuries of weight behind them. He did not need to explain why a headless rider was terrifying. His readers, whether of Dutch, German, or Irish descent, already carried that fear in their cultural memory. The brilliance of Irving's story was to give the figure an American stage, a specific burial ground, a specific battlefield, a specific valley where the legend could take root. But the roots themselves were tangled deep in European soil, in stories of phantoms who rode without heads long before anyone had heard of Sleepy Hollow. Among all the European ancestors of the Headless Horseman, none is more vivid, more terrifying, or more deeply ingrained in cultural memory than the Dullahan of Ireland. This figure was not just a story told to frighten children, he was believed to be real, a manifestation of death itself that could appear without warning, bringing with him terror and inevitability. To understand how the legend of the Headless Horseman took shape in America, one must first confront the Dullahan, for he embodies the purest and darkest form of the headless rider myth. The Irish landscape has always been rich in myth, rolling hills dotted with ancient stone circles, mist rising off bogs and rivers, ruined castles silhouetted against the sky. These were places where the line between the natural and the supernatural blurred. In such a landscape, the imagination needed little encouragement to see phantoms riding across the fields at dusk. But the Dullahan was not a vague, shapeless spirit. His description was strikingly consistent. He was said to ride a massive black horse, taller and stronger than any living beast, its eyes glowing like embers, its breath steaming as if from some internal furnace. Sparks flew from its hooves as they struck the ground, and in some stories flames burst from its nostrils. This horse was not an animal of flesh and blood, it was an extension of the supernatural, as relentless and unnatural as its rider. The rider himself was always headless. Sometimes his head was missing entirely, leaving only a grotesque stump of a neck from which oozed dark blood that stained his clothing. More often, however, he carried his head in one hand, holding it by the hair like a lantern. The head was no ordinary object. Its features were exaggerated, swollen, and distorted. The skin had the color and texture of rotting cheese, a pale yellow-green glow that made it visible in the dark. Its mouth was stretched into a permanent grin, wide and mocking, filled with rows of sharp teeth. The eyes were said to dart back and forth, never resting, able to see across vast distances and even into the souls of men. To encounter that gaze was to know that your fate had already been sealed. Unlike many ghosts who wander aimlessly or repeat the circumstances of their death, the Dullahan had a purpose. He was the harbinger of death. His appearance in a village, on a road, or outside a house meant that someone's life was about to end. He did not kill with a weapon in the conventional sense, though he sometimes carried a whip made from a human spine,
which he cracked at those who dared to look upon him. His true weapon was his voice, or rather the single word he spoke. The Dullahan would ride until he reached the home of the person whose time had come. Then, raising his grisly head aloft, he would call out their name. In that instant, no matter how far away the person might be, their soul was torn from their body, and death was immediate.
No doctor, no priest, no prayer could intervene. When the Dullahan spoke your name, your fate was sealed. This gave the Dullahan a terrifying inevitability. Unlike other monsters of folklore who might be tricked, evaded, or appeased, the Dullahan was unstoppable. His presence was a sentence, not a threat. You did not bargain with him, you did not escape him. The only defense, according to tradition, was gold. For reasons never fully explained, the Dullahan feared the sight of the metal. Even a small piece of gold, a coin, a brooch, a ring, could drive him back. This strange weakness may have been tied to older beliefs in the power of precious metals to repel evil, or perhaps it was a reflection of the value placed on gold as a protective charm. Whatever its origin, it gave a sliver of hope to those who feared the rider. Travelers in rural Ireland sometimes carried coins not only for commerce, but as talismans against the black horse and its headless master. The origins of the Dullahan are ancient. Many folklorists connect him to the old Celtic fertility god Crom Dubh, who demanded human sacrifice. In some traditions, decapitation was a form of offering, and the severed head was a symbol of power. Over time, as Christianity spread and pagan rituals were suppressed, Crom Dubh's memory may have transformed into the terrifying figure of the headless deathbringer. What was once a god receiving sacrifices became a demon delivering death.
This process of demonization was common as Christianization reshaped older myths, turning deities into devils, guardians into ghouls. The Dullahan, in this sense, may be a distorted echo of an ancient god. But even without such connections, the imagery of the Dullahan struck deep. To see a man riding without a head was to confront the unnatural. To hear that he called out names was to feel the certainty of mortality. The Irish countryside was filled with dangers, famine, disease, violence, and the Dullahan embodied all of them. He was not an enemy to be fought, but a force to be endured. His legend persisted because it gave a face, or rather a lack of face, to the inescapable fact of death. The Dullahan was not confined to a single county or region. Tales of him were told across Ireland, though details varied. In some stories he rode alone, in silence, his horse's hooves the only sound. In others, he was part of a spectral procession, a funeral cavalcade of headless riders and coaches. These coaches were known as Coiste Bodhar, or the silent coach, pulled by black horses and driven by a headless coachman. To see such a procession on the road was to witness an omen of death, not only for an individual, but for an entire community. Sometimes the Dullahan himself drove the coach, his whip lashing out at those who dared to cross its path. Descriptions of his appearance also varied. Some said his head was smooth and featureless, glowing with an inner light. Others described it as grotesquely human, with exaggerated features meant to terrify. The one detail that remained constant was the grin, a permanent, mocking smile that reminded the living of their powerlessness. Whether the grin was seen as sadistic or simply inevitable, it was the detail most often remembered by those who claimed to have glimpsed him. The fear of the Dullahan was not abstract. In rural Ireland, people took the legend seriously. Doors were locked at night not only against thieves but against the rider. Children were warned not to linger outdoors after sunset. Those who claimed to hear the pounding hooves or see the flickering glow of the severed head spoke of it with trembling conviction. For them, the Dullahan was not a metaphor. He was a presence, a real danger that might appear on any lonely road. Over time, the legend spread beyond Ireland. Irish immigrants carried it with them to England, Scotland, and eventually America. Wherever the Irish went, stories of the headless rider followed. By the time Washington Irving was writing in the early 19th century, tales of the Dullahan had already circulated for generations, especially in communities where Irish settlers lived alongside Germans and Dutch. Each group contributed its own headless legends, and together they formed the foundation from which the American horseman emerged. The Dullahan's influence can be clearly seen in the details of Irving's tale.
The American horseman, like his Irish ancestor, is headless. He carries his missing head, sometimes under his arm. He rides a powerful black horse that outpaces any mortal steed. He appears suddenly on lonely roads at night, and his presence signals doom. The main difference is purpose. Irving's phantom is often said to be searching for his lost head, tied to his burial place in Sleepy Hollow, while the Dullahan is not searching at all. He knows exactly what he is doing. He is delivering death, yet the similarity of imagery is undeniable. The grin of the pumpkin head glowing in the dark is not far removed from the grotesque smile of the Dullahan's severed face. The Irish legend gave the headless rider a terrifying edge that resonated across cultures. It was not simply the horror of a missing head, it was the inevitability of pursuit, the certainty of death, the sense that once the rider appeared, nothing could save you. Even today, in parts of Ireland, echoes of the Dullahan linger. People still speak of headless riders seen near graveyards or crossroads, still carry charms against his presence. He remains a living figure in folklore, a grim reminder of mortality on horseback. When one looks at the American headless horseman, it is clear that he is, in part, the Dullahan reborn in a new land. The black horse, the severed head, the relentless pursuit, all of these elements trace back to the Irish phantom.
What Irving added was local colour, Revolutionary War history, and the ambiguity of whether the ghost was real or a trick. But behind the American story, the Irish shadow looms. The Dullahan was the original harbinger, the dark figure galloping across the hills, reminding the living that death comes for all, and it comes on a horse without mercy. Germany's forests have always carried an aura of mystery, dense, dark, and seemingly endless. They shaped not only the geography, but also the imagination of the people who lived alongside them. Long before the stories of Sleepy Hollow reached American ears, German villagers were already whispering about ghostly riders who swept through the woods and skies, figures who blurred the line between human, spirit, and demon. Among these, none was more enduring or more feared than the wild huntsman, a spectral leader who rode with a host of ghostly followers, announcing storms, death, and chaos wherever he passed. It is from this fertile ground of German folklore that another crucial ancestor of the American headless horseman emerges. The image of the wild hunt is one of the most striking in European folklore. On stormy nights, when the wind howled through the trees and thunder rolled across the sky, people claimed to hear the pounding of hooves, the barking of hounds, and the cries of hunters in the air. Some swore they saw them, a great cavalcade of spectral riders sweeping across the heavens, their leader at the front, sometimes headless, sometimes bearing a monstrous visage, always terrifying. The wild hunt was not a single story, but a motif repeated across countless regions of Germany and Scandinavia. In some places, the leader was known as Woden, the old god who later became associated with Odin.
In others, he was a cursed nobleman, a wicked gamekeeper, or even a fallen knight doomed to ride forever. The German huntsman was not always headless, but he often carried the same qualities of the headless rider: relentlessness, supernatural speed, and the ability to terrify travelers caught on the road at night. Those unlucky enough to see the hunt were advised to throw themselves to the ground, face down, and not move until it passed. To look upon the huntsman was dangerous. To hear him call your name was deadly. Some versions described him abducting souls to join his hunt, dragging mortals into the storm to ride forever among the damned. Others described him as a punisher, targeting oath-breakers, thieves, or the unbaptized. Whatever the version, the core idea was the same. The huntsman and his ghostly host embodied the chaos of the wilderness, a force outside human control that could sweep through villages without warning. The connection to headlessness comes from several regional variants. In parts of Lower Saxony and Hesse, villagers spoke of a headless rider who led or followed the hunt, sometimes carrying his head under his arm, sometimes missing it altogether. He was a spirit of the restless dead, often linked to violent death in battle. Soldiers who had been decapitated or dishonored were said to rise as spectral horsemen, unable to rest. These figures blurred together with the image of the wild huntsman, so that in many places the leader himself was imagined as headless, his missing head a mark of his cursed existence. The symbolism of the wild hunt resonated deeply with German communities because it explained the uncontrollable. Storms, sudden deaths, failed harvests, all could be attributed to the passage of the hunt. Hearing the pounding of hooves in the night or the howling of dogs when no animals were near became proof that the hunt was riding. It gave people a way to make sense of disaster, to frame chaos in the shape of a terrifying but recognizable figure. Instead of random misfortune, there was the huntsman and his host, and once named, he became all the more real. Like the Dullahan in Ireland, the wild huntsman was more than a ghost. He was an embodiment of forces beyond human control. He represented nature's fury, death's inevitability, and the thin line between the living and the dead. To see him was to know that you had glimpsed something no mortal should see, and just as with the Dullahan, gold was sometimes said to repel him, suggesting that deep European beliefs about the protective power of precious metals ran through multiple traditions. The German imagination also produced more localized headless riders, often tied to specific places. In Thuringia, villagers told of a headless horseman who haunted the woods near certain castles, pursuing travelers who dared to ride after sunset. In Saxony, legends spoke of a decapitated knight who could be heard galloping along the same road where he had been killed centuries earlier. In these tales, the horseman was not a god or a cosmic force, but a restless spirit, bound to a particular landscape, his endless riding a punishment for sins in life or a refusal of death to release him. These regional tales helped create the cultural foundation into which Irving's horsemen would later fit so easily. What made the German stories so influential was their sheer abundance. Every valley, every town seemed to have its own variation of the ghostly rider. Sometimes he was a soldier, sometimes a hunter, sometimes a nobleman cursed for cruelty. In all cases, his presence turned ordinary roads into places of fear. Night travel was always dangerous in the pre-modern world, but the idea that you might meet a supernatural rider along the way made the danger all the more vivid. Parents told children never to wander into the woods alone, not only because of wolves or thieves, but because of the huntsman. Travelers prayed at crossroads to avoid his path. The legends became woven into daily life, not merely stories, but explanations for caution. The connection between the German huntsman and the American horseman becomes clear when one considers the Hessian element of Irving's tale. Hessian soldiers were German mercenaries who fought for the British during the American Revolution. To imagine one of them decapitated in battle and haunting the fields of Sleepy Hollow was a natural fusion of American history and German folklore. The people of the Hudson Valley, many of them of Dutch and German descent, would have recognized the motif. A headless soldier on horseback was not just a clever invention. It was an old figure transplanted into new soil. Irving's decision to make his horseman a Hessian did more than add historical realism. It tied the legend directly to European roots. A German ghost, displaced by war, now haunted American ground. The headless horseman of Sleepy Hollow was therefore both local and foreign, both an American phantom and a descendant of the wild huntsman. This dual identity gave him greater power,
connecting him to centuries of European fear while anchoring him firmly in American memory. The wild huntsman's presence in folklore also reveals why the headless motif resonated so strongly. In the chaos of a storm, in the roar of thunder and the howl of wind, people saw riders because they needed a form to give the storm. The headless rider, stripped of identity but full of fury, fit the role perfectly. He was the storm personified, riding through the world of men as a reminder of nature's dominance. Irving captured a version of this when he described the horseman pursuing Ichabod through the night. The chase was not just a prank or a haunting. It was a storm breaking into the human world, unstoppable, overwhelming, beyond reason. Even today, in rural Germany, echoes of the wild huntsman linger. Folk festivals sometimes reenact the hunt, complete with riders in masks and cloaks. Old ballads tell of the huntsman's passage, and local legends still describe ghostly riders haunting certain places. The myth never vanished because the forests never lost their mystery. As long as there were roads winding through the dark, as long as thunder rolled across the sky, the sound of unseen riders remained believable. When comparing the German wild huntsman to the Irish Dullahan, one sees both differences and similarities. The Dullahan was specific, personal, naming his victims, while the huntsman was collective, sweeping across the land with a host. The Dullahan's weapon was his voice and his whip, while the huntsman's weapon was fear itself, the terror of being caught in his path. Yet both embodied inevitability. Both were reminders that death was not an abstract concept, but a presence that could appear on the road without warning. Together, they shaped the image of the headless rider that Irving would later harness, transforming it into America's most enduring phantom. In this way, the horseman of Sleepy Hollow carries in his saddle not only the weight of American history, but the shadows of Europe's oldest fears. He is the Dullahan reborn and the wild huntsman displaced, a fusion of Irish death omen and German storm spirit, a ghost who gallops across oceans and centuries. And once he took form in the American imagination, he proved as unstoppable as the hunt itself, riding from the valleys of Europe into the pages of literature, and from there into the nightmares of generations.
The image of the headless horseman is powerful not only because he is a rider, but because he is headless. The absence of the head is what makes the figure unforgettable. A rider on a black horse could be explained as a thief, a soldier, or a shadow in the mist. But a man without a head is something else entirely. It is a violation of the human form so absolute that it strips away familiarity and leaves only horror. To understand why the figure endures, one must explore the symbolism of the missing head itself, a motif that echoes across many cultures and eras. The head has always been seen as the seat of identity. It carries the face, the eyes, the mouth, the features that allow us to recognize one another, to communicate, to express thought and emotion. To lose the head is to lose individuality. A headless body becomes anonymous, stripped of personality and voice. In battle, decapitation was the ultimate mark of defeat. The body without the head was incomplete, dishonored, a warning to others. Across Europe, the heads of executed criminals were displayed on spikes above city gates, a gruesome spectacle that reminded all who passed of the consequences of disobedience. The severed head carried meaning as both trophy and warning. The headless corpse, by contrast, was pitiful and uncanny, a symbol of a life violently interrupted. In Celtic culture, the head held special power. Archaeological finds from Iron Age Europe reveal carved stone heads placed in shrines, severed heads buried with care, and accounts from Roman historians describing Celtic warriors who collected the heads of their enemies as prized trophies. To the Celts, the head was the seat of the soul, the essence of the individual. To possess an enemy's head was to control their spirit. In this context, The Dullahan's grotesque, glowing head makes sense. It was not just a gruesome detail, but a reflection of a very old belief. The head contained supernatural power, even when severed from the body. The Greeks, too, connected decapitation with a violent crossing of boundaries. The myth of Medusa ends with Perseus carrying her severed head as a weapon, its gaze still deadly even after death. Orpheus, torn apart by the Maenads, continued to sing as his head floated down the river. In both stories, the severed head retained power, sometimes more than the living body had possessed. This persistence of the head as an object of dread and fascination reinforced the idea that to be headless was unnatural, and to carry a severed head was to wield a dangerous force. In Christian Europe, martyrdom often involved beheading. Saints who died by the sword were sometimes said to pick up their own severed heads and continue walking, a motif known as the cephalophore. Saint Denis of Paris was famously depicted carrying his head in his hands, preaching even in death. This image, meant to inspire awe, also carried horror. A holy man walking without a head blurred the line between miracle and monstrosity. The cephalophore motif likely reinforced the symbolic power of the headless figure in popular imagination. If even saints could appear headless, then ordinary sinners might return in grotesque forms as punishment or curse. In Asia, similar themes appear. In Hindu mythology, the goddess Chinnamasta is depicted as headless, holding her severed head in her hand while streams of blood spurt from her neck to nourish her attendants. She represents self-sacrifice and the cycle of life and death, but the image remains shocking, unsettling, even terrifying to those who first encounter it. In Buddhist iconography, wrathful deities sometimes appear with severed heads as trophies, symbols of conquering ignorance or evil. Across cultures, the head is not merely flesh and bone, it is the seat of spirit, knowledge, and life force. To lose it or to manipulate it is to tamper with the very essence of being. This explains why the headless rider is more than a ghost. He is a contradiction made flesh. A body without a head should not live. A rider without eyes should not see. Yet the headless horseman not only moves, but pursues with precision. The impossibility of his existence is what makes him terrifying. He embodies the breakdown of natural law. He should not be, and yet he is. That tension unsettles the human mind more than any ordinary monster could.
The absence of a head also silences. The rider does not speak, or if he does, his voice comes from an impossible place. In folklore, silence is frightening because it denies communication. A ghost who explains itself can be understood. A ghost who remains silent is unknowable. The headless horseman communicates only through pursuit, through the pounding of hooves, through the raised weapon or the hurled pumpkin. His silence makes him more frightening because it forces the living to interpret his intent without certainty. Is he angry, mournful, vengeful? No one knows, because he cannot say. The missing head ensures eternal ambiguity. Psychologically, the image of a headless body taps into deep fears of mutilation and dismemberment. The human form is comforting in its wholeness. We recognize ourselves in it. When that form is broken, when a head is missing, it becomes grotesque, uncanny, a perversion of what we know. Sigmund Freud, writing centuries later, would call this the uncanny. The terror produced by something familiar made unfamiliar. A headless rider is precisely that. A man on horseback is familiar, even ordinary. Remove the head, and the entire image becomes monstrous. The symbolism of headlessness also connects to themes of punishment and justice. Decapitation was often the penalty for treason, rebellion, or grave crimes. To see a headless figure was to be reminded of law and authority, of the ultimate price of defiance.
Some legends describe headless riders as criminals condemned to ride forever as punishment, their endless wandering a mirror of their disgrace. Others describe noblemen or knights who were beheaded unjustly, returning as restless spirits, to demand vengeance. In either case, the missing head signaled unfinished business, a story unresolved, a soul unable to rest. In some traditions, headlessness also symbolized the loss of reason or control. The head houses the brain, the center of thought. To be without it is to act without sense, to be driven only by instinct or rage. The headless horseman, therefore, is not just frightening because of his appearance, but because of what he represents, a force ungoverned by reason, pure pursuit, pure inevitability. He is the body without the mind, action without thought, death without explanation. Even in cultures where decapitation was rare, the symbolism persisted. In Japan, legends of the Rokurokubi described spirits whose heads could detach and fly away at night, leaving their bodies behind. The separation of head and body was always portrayed as uncanny, dangerous, a violation of the natural order. To be divided in this way was to be monstrous. The universality of this motif suggests that across human cultures, the head has always been seen as inseparable from identity. Its absence creates a void too terrible to ignore. The pumpkin in Irving's tale, used as a substitute head, adds another layer of meaning. A pumpkin carved into a face is both comical and horrifying, a parody of humanity. It reflects the same discomfort that severed heads produced in older traditions. A false head, a mask of what should be, is as unsettling as the absence itself. The jack-o'-lantern grinning in the night is the American echo of the Dullahan's rotting head, a localized version of the same ancient fear. It is this symbolism that explains why the headless horseman has lasted so long. He is not only a ghost tied to a single place or time, he is the embodiment of a universal fear, the fear of losing what makes us human, of being reduced to a body without identity, of being pursued by a force that has lost its own face and voice. To see him is to see not only death, but the destruction of self. And so, across cultures and centuries, the headless have ridden. In Ireland, the Dullahan; in Germany, the huntsman; in America, the Hessian of Sleepy Hollow. Different names, different costumes, but always the same horror. A body without a head, a rider without a face, a figure that should not exist and yet does. It is a nightmare that belongs to no single nation, but to humanity itself, as ancient as the fear of death and as enduring as the roads we still walk at night. When the legend of the Headless Horseman took shape in Sleepy Hollow, it did so in a community where war was not a distant memory, but a living scar. The American Revolution had passed only a generation earlier, and its consequences remained visible in the villages, farms, and families of the Hudson Valley. Sleepy Hollow, with its Dutch heritage and close-knit character, was still marked by the anxieties of that era, anxieties of violence, of death without burial, of the supernatural forces that seemed to linger in a land where blood had so recently been spilled. To understand why the tale of a decapitated Hessian soldier resonated so deeply, one has to see the valley not only as a place of mist and marshes, but as a community still haunted by war. The Revolutionary War in the Hudson Valley was brutal. Unlike set-piece battles fought in open fields, much of the conflict here was irregular: raids, ambushes, skirmishes that left no clear front line. Farmers found their homes burned, their crops destroyed, their families displaced. The valley became a corridor of violence caught between British forces, Hessian mercenaries, and patriot militias. For the people who lived there, war was not an abstraction. It was a constant threat, a chaos that could arrive at their door in the middle of the night. Among the most feared of the British auxiliaries were the Hessians, German soldiers hired to fight against the revolutionaries. They were disciplined, professional, and often ruthless. To the farmers of the valley, they seemed like foreign invaders, speaking a language few could understand, fighting for a cause that was not their own. Stories spread of their ferocity in battle, their brutal efficiency, their willingness to carry out harsh punishments. When such men died on American soil, far from their homeland, without family or proper burial, it was easy for locals to imagine their spirits wandering. A Hessian cut down by a cannonball, his head destroyed in an instant of violence, was the perfect candidate for a restless ghost. Death in battle was terrifying enough, but death without burial carried special dread. In colonial America, as in Europe, burial was not only a practical necessity, but a spiritual one. To be denied a grave was to be denied rest. Unburied soldiers left on fields or hastily covered in shallow pits were thought to become restless spirits, unable to cross into the afterlife. Sleepy Hollow, with its old Dutch burial ground, was already a place heavy with associations of the dead. To imagine that a headless soldier rose from such ground to ride the roads at night was a natural extension of the fears people carried in their hearts. The supernatural was never far from colonial life. Despite Enlightenment ideals spreading through Europe, rural communities clung to a worldview where the visible and invisible coexisted. Disease could be explained by spirits. Bad harvests could be blamed on curses. Ghost stories were not just entertainment, but moral lessons, warnings, and explanations for the hardships of life. Sleepy Hollow was known even in Irving's time for its reputation as a place of enchantment. Visitors described it as unusually prone to superstition, where nearly every family had a ghost tale to tell. In such an environment, the legend of the Headless Horseman was not an oddity. It was part of the fabric of daily life. The anxieties of the colonial period made the legend even stronger. The revolution had not only brought violence but had disrupted the order of society. Old loyalties were divided. Neighbors turned against neighbors. Families were torn apart by politics, some siding with the patriots, others with the loyalists. Communities that had once been bound together by tradition now carried deep fractures. Such tension naturally gave rise to stories that reflected instability. A ghost who rode without a head symbolized the loss of unity, the breakdown of order. He was not whole, just as the community itself was not whole. Sleepy Hollow's geography reinforced these fears. The valley was isolated, its roads twisting through dark woods and marshes. At night, sounds carried strangely. The cry of an animal could sound like a human scream. The echo of hooves might belong to a living horse or something else entirely. When fear already ran high, when memories of raids and battles were still fresh, the landscape became a stage on which the imagination acted freely. A rider galloping in the night could too easily be mistaken for a ghost, and once such stories were told, they spread quickly. The idea of a headless soldier was particularly potent. Decapitation in war was not common, but when it occurred, by cannon fire, by sword, it was remembered with horror. A man who lost his head lost not only his life but his identity. In folklore, this violent removal of the head was often linked to restlessness in death. The soul could not leave the body properly if the body itself was incomplete. The Hessian soldier of Sleepy Hollow, therefore, became a symbol of the thousands who had died violently, without peace, during the revolution. His legend condensed collective grief and fear into a single terrifying figure. Religion also shaped the way people interpreted such stories. The Dutch Reformed Church, central to Sleepy Hollow's community, preached of sin, salvation, and the reality of damnation. In sermons, ministers spoke of spirits, angels, and demons as active forces in the world. Parishioners were taught to see the supernatural as real and immediate. The Headless Horseman fit easily into this worldview, a reminder of the wages of sin, the danger of unbelief, or the presence of the devil in the world. Ghosts were not dismissed as superstition, but taken as evidence of divine or demonic activity. The Revolutionary War also left behind a culture of memory and trauma. Families told stories of battles not only as history but as warnings.
Children grew up hearing how their fathers or grandfathers had fought, suffered, or died. War was not distant. It lived in memory, in stories, in the scars on the land. To imagine that soldiers still roamed, unable to rest, was a natural extension of that memory. The horseman became a way of remembering war's violence without speaking of it directly. He was the past riding into the present, a phantom reminder that blood had been spilled on the very roads people now traveled. At the same time, the horseman was more than a figure of grief. He was also a figure of control. To tell children not to stay out late, parents could invoke his presence. To warn travelers not to risk certain roads at night, neighbors could speak of the horseman. Folklore served practical purposes, shaping behavior, enforcing caution, protecting the community from real dangers disguised as supernatural ones. In this sense, the legend was useful, a tool for survival in a world where danger lurked behind every shadow. Sleepy Hollow's anxiety was not only about death, but about identity. In a land caught between old Dutch traditions and the emerging American nation, between European heritage and the realities of a new republic, the community struggled with who it was. The horseman, a German soldier who refused to leave, embodied that tension. He was a foreigner made permanent, a reminder that the old world still haunted the new.
His headlessness symbolized a loss of identity, a body without a face, just as the community itself wrestled with its changing sense of self. Washington Irving captured all of this when he wrote his story. He framed the horseman not only as a terrifying ghost, but as part of the natural fabric of Sleepy Hollow. He described the villagers as deeply susceptible to superstition, as people who accepted the supernatural as readily as they accepted the weather. This was not a mocking description. It was a recognition that in a community still marked by colonial anxieties, war memories, and religious fears, such stories were not absurd. They were inevitable. The horseman, then, was more than a ghost story. He was the embodiment of a community's fear of death without rest, its memory of war, its suspicion of foreigners, and its struggle with identity. He was the supernatural face of very real anxieties, the phantom who gave shape to the dread that lingered in every house, every road, every shadow of Sleepy Hollow. And when he rode through the valley in the imagination of its people, he carried not just his missing head, but the collective weight of a community haunted by its own past. When Washington Irving shaped his tale of the Headless Horseman, he gave the phantom its stage, but he also gave it its victim. And in doing so, he created one of the most memorable figures in early American literature, Ichabod Crane. Tall, lanky, awkward, and hungry in every sense of the word, Ichabod was not the heroic rider who faced danger with bravery. He was the outsider, the schoolmaster who never quite belonged, the man whose ambition and vanity made him both comic and tragic. His role in the story was not only to encounter the ghost, but to embody the insecurities of a society where class, wealth, and belonging determined survival. To understand why the legend has endured, one must look as closely at Ichabod as at the horseman who pursued him. Ichabod's description is unforgettable. Irving paints him as absurdly tall and thin, with arms and legs that seemed too long for his body, with feet like shovels and a nose like a beak. His whole frame was ungainly, awkward, so much so that his very presence was comical. Yet despite this awkwardness, he carried himself with a certain air of importance, as though he believed himself destined for more than the modest life of a rural schoolteacher. The villagers of Sleepy Hollow laughed at him, imitated him, and never quite accepted him as one of their own. From the beginning, Ichabod was marked as different. His outsider status mattered.
Sleepy Hollow was a community deeply rooted in tradition, where Dutch families had lived for generations, their customs, language, and stories binding them together. Into this world came Ichabod, not a farmer, not a soldier, not a man tied to the soil,
but a wandering schoolteacher, earning a meager living by teaching children their letters and numbers. He boarded with different families, moving from house to house, dependent on the hospitality of others. In a community that valued permanence, land, and inheritance, Ichabod represented instability. He was educated but poor, respected for his knowledge but never fully trusted. He was, in every sense, an intruder. Yet Ichabod was not content with his station. He hungered for more food, more wealth, more recognition. Irving delights in describing his gluttony. Ichabod loved to eat, and his appetite often dictated his choices. When invited to a family's home, he would imagine the poultry, pies, and preserves waiting in the kitchen, his mind lingering on the bounty even as he pretended to be polite. At gatherings, he ate with a zeal that shocked the locals, who saw in him a bottomless hunger that mirrored his ambition. His pursuit of Katrina van Tassel, the wealthy daughter of a prosperous farmer, was fueled as much by his desire for her father's abundant farm as by any affection for the girl herself. For Ichabod, Katrina represented a way out of poverty, a ticket into comfort and stability. This ambition made him both relatable and ridiculous. Many readers could understand his longing for a better life, but they could also laugh at the way he carried himself, imagining grand futures even as he remained a penniless schoolmaster. Irving plays on this tension, making Ichabod at once sympathetic and comical. He is not wicked, but he is greedy. He is not evil, but he is vain. He is the kind of character who draws misfortune to himself through his own flaws. In this way, Ichabod's encounter with the horseman becomes more than a ghost story. It becomes a morality tale. The outsider who covets too much, who desires wealth and status beyond his reach, is punished, or at least humiliated, by forces beyond his control. The horseman becomes not only a ghost, but an agent of justice, exposing Ichabod's weakness. Whether the phantom was real, or whether Brom Bones tricked him with a pumpkin, the effect was the same. Ichabod was driven from the community, his ambitions shattered, his presence erased. Ichabod also represents the tension between rationality and superstition. As a schoolteacher, he is supposed to embody knowledge, reason, and education. Yet he is also deeply superstitious, eagerly listening to ghost stories told by the villagers, believing every rumor and tale. He reads Cotton Mather's History of New England Witchcraft with relish, filling his imagination with visions of spirits, demons, and witches. By day he teaches children their lessons. By night he trembles at shadows and strange noises. This contradiction makes him particularly vulnerable. His education does not protect him from fear. In fact, it heightens it, giving him more material with which to frighten himself. He is the perfect prey for the legend of the horseman because he already half believes in him before the chase even begins. The relationship between Ichabod and Brom Bones sharpens this role. Brom, the local hero, is everything Ichabod is not. Strong, boisterous, confident, Brom belongs to the community. He is admired by the men and desired by the women. Where Ichabod is thin and awkward, Brom is muscular and sure. Where Ichabod is calculating, Brom is impulsive and bold. Their rivalry over Katrina highlights the contrast between the outsider and the insider, the pretender and the rightful heir. When Brom hears of Ichabod's courtship, he responds not with open hostility but with pranks, mocking him, embarrassing him, undermining him at every turn. In this contest, Ichabod never truly has a chance. His downfall is written not only in his flaws, but in his opponent's strength. The climactic ride, then, can be read as a duel between Ichabod and Brom, with the horseman as either a ghostly avenger or Brom's disguise. If the horseman is real, Ichabod's fear and flaws doom him to fail. If the horseman is Brom in disguise, Ichabod's cowardice makes him the perfect victim. Either way, the chase reveals Ichabod's true character. He is not brave. He is not clever. He is not destined for greatness. He is simply terrified, fleeing wildly through the woods until a hurled pumpkin and the crushing weight of humiliation ends his ambitions. In this reading, Ichabod's role is essential. Without him, the horseman would be a nameless ghost, a figure glimpsed in the dark. It is Ichabod's fear, Ichabod's flight, that brings the phantom to life. Through his eyes, readers feel the terror of being pursued, the desperation of trying to reach the bridge, the panic of hearing hooves thunder behind. The headless horseman becomes real, not because of his own presence, but because Ichabod makes him real. He is the perfect victim because he embodies the human tendency to let fear overwhelm reason. But Ichabod is not only prey, he is also, in a sense, a trickster's foil. The story of Sleepy Hollow is filled with humor as well as horror, and Ichabod often provides the comedy. His exaggerated mannerisms, his appetite, his vanity, his attempts at courtship, all of these make him a target for laughter. Brom's pranks succeed because Ichabod is so easy to ridicule. He sets himself up for failure by imagining himself the center of importance when the community sees him as an oddity. In this way, Ichabod is less a tragic figure and more a comic one, a character whose downfall is inevitable because of who he is. The trickster needs a fool to play upon, and Ichabod provides that role perfectly. Yet Irving does not leave him entirely mocked. There is an edge of sympathy in his portrayal. Ichabod's hunger for more food, more comfort, more wealth, is deeply human. His ambition, though exaggerated, reflects the desires of many in a society where wealth was unevenly distributed and status determined one's place. Readers may laugh at Ichabod, but they also recognize something of themselves in him. His failure becomes not just comedy, but a cautionary tale about the dangers of overreaching, of letting greed and fear dictate one's life. The ambiguity of Ichabod's fate deepens the story. Did he truly vanish, carried off by the horseman into the night? Or did he simply flee, humiliated, never daring to return to Sleepy Hollow? Irving leaves the question open, allowing the legend to thrive. For the villagers, Ichabod's disappearance was proof of the horseman's power. For skeptics, it was evidence of Brom's cleverness. For readers, it was a reminder that the truth lies somewhere between belief and doubt. Ichabod himself became part of the legend, his name forever tied to the phantom he could not escape. In this way, Ichabod Crane is as essential to the myth as the horseman himself. Without the outsider to pursue, the ghost has no story. Without the fearful schoolmaster to flee through the night, the chase has no drama. Oh, Ichabod gives the horseman meaning by being his prey, his victim, his comic counterweight. Together they form a pair, the terrifying rider and the terrified fool, whose interaction defines the legend. And so, the story of Sleepy Hollow is not only about a ghost. It is about the outsider who dared to want too much, who feared too much, who believed too much. It is about the way communities treat those who do not belong, the way ambition can make one blind, and the way fear can make even the educated powerless. Ichabod Crane, lanky, awkward and hungry, remains unforgettable because he embodies both our laughter and our dread. He is the one who hears the hooves behind him, who sees the pumpkin flying through the night, who vanishes into legend so that the headless horseman may ride forever. If Ichabod Crane is the outsider, the man who does not fit in, then Brom Bones is his mirror opposite. The insider, the man who embodies everything Sleepy Hollow values. Where Ichabod is lanky, awkward and comical, Brom is broad-shouldered, confident and admired. Where Ichabod drifts from house to house, dependent on hospitality, Brom is rooted in the community, with friends, allies, and a reputation that gives him power. Their rivalry over Katrina Van Tassel is not simply a contest for affection, it is a symbolic clash between two ways of belonging, one tenuous and grasping, the other secure and exuberant. Brom Bones is as crucial to the legend as Ichabod and the horseman, for without him, the story would not carry its full weight of human rivalry, pride and humiliation. Brom's very name carries meaning. His full name, Abraham van Brunt, marks him as Dutch, part of the long-established families of the Hudson Valley. Unlike Ichabod, who drifts into the village from elsewhere, Brom belongs by birthright. His nickname, Brom Bones, speaks to his physicality. He is strong, brawny, muscular, a man who thrives in contests of strength, horsemanship, and courage. Irving describes him as something of a local hero, a young man who leads a gang of rough but good-natured rowdies, always ready for a race, a wrestling match, or a prank. He is admired by the men and desired by the women, his boisterous personality making him larger than life. This charisma is key to understanding the rivalry. Ichabod, with his learning and his pretensions, imagines himself worthy of Katrina because of his education. But Katrina lives in a world where strength, confidence, and community matter more than book learning. Brom embodies those values. He is loud, bold, and secure in his place. The villagers laugh with him, not at him. He is a leader, not a hanger-on. In every way that matters to Sleepy Hollow, Brom is already a winner. The rivalry, then, is less about Katrina herself and more about what she represents. For Ichabod, she is wealth, security, the gateway to a better life. For Brom, she is a prize that confirms his dominance, his right to claim whatever he desires. Their contest is unequal from the start, not because Ichabod lacks interest, but because he lacks standing. The villagers root for Brom not only because they like him, but because he is one of them. To see him win is to see their values affirmed. To see Ichabod win would be to see an outsider disrupt the order of things. Brom's tactics in the rivalry reveal his nature. He does not confront Ichabod directly in open hostility. Instead, he mocks him, plays tricks on him, and undermines him through ridicule. He turns Ichabod's superstition against him, telling stories of ghosts and spirits that prey on the schoolmaster's imagination. He exploits Ichabod's weaknesses rather than attacking his strengths.
This is cleverness of a different sort from Ichabod's bookish knowledge. It is the cleverness of the prankster, the trickster, who knows how to manipulate people through humor and fear. In this way, Brom is not only Ichabod's rival, but his foil. He exposes Ichabod's vulnerabilities by amplifying them, making him look ridiculous in the eyes of the community. The possibility that Brom himself was the horseman on that fateful night only sharpens his role. If the phantom was a ghost, Ichabod's fear destroyed him. If the phantom was Brom in disguise, then it was Brom's prank that accomplished the same goal. In either case, Ichabod was humiliated and defeated, and Brom emerged victorious. The ambiguity is central to the legend, for it allows the horseman to remain both supernatural and human at once. Brom's shadow falls across the ghost, making it impossible to separate entirely the prankster from the phantom. The legend thrives precisely because it is unclear whether Ichabod was undone by the supernatural or by the cunning of his rival. Brom's connection to horses is another key detail. He is described as an expert rider, always ready to race, always certain of his skill. His horse, Daredevil, reflects his own personality, wild, spirited, fearless. In contrast, Ichabod rides a broken-down old plough horse named Gunpowder, comical in its stubbornness and awkwardness. The contrast could not be clearer. One man rides with confidence, the other clings desperately to a mount ill-suited for him. When the climactic chase begins, this difference in horsemanship underscores the imbalance of the rivalry. Whether Brom is behind the mask of the horseman or not, his identity as a rider hovers in the background. The very act of being pursued by a phantom horseman feels like an extension of Brom's dominance. In folklore, rivals often embody broader themes, and Brom's rivalry with Ichabod fits this pattern. He is the local trickster hero, the one who outwits the outsider, protects his community, and restores balance through mockery. His triumph is not only personal, but communal. By humiliating Ichabod, he reaffirms the values of Sleepy Hollow: strength, humor, belonging and distrust of outsiders who reach too high. In this sense, Brom is not just a rival for Katrina's hand. He is the representative of the hollow itself, the living embodiment of the village's resistance to intrusion. Yet Brom is not a villain. Irving paints him with affection as a mischievous but likable figure. His pranks are rough but not malicious. His rivalry with Ichabod is spirited rather than cruel. Even if he did disguise himself as the horseman, the act is framed as cleverness rather than villainy. Brom is admired precisely because he wins without bitterness. He is the community's golden son, boisterous but good-hearted, the kind of figure around whom legends naturally grow.
The ambiguity of his role in the horseman's chase keeps him interesting. If he was the Phantom, then the tale is a story of human rivalry disguised as supernatural terror. If he was not, then his shadow still looms, for Ichabod's fear of him may have been as great as his fear of the ghost. In either case, Brom and the horseman are linked, twin figures of masculine power and pursuit. Ichabod's downfall is as much Brom's triumph as it is the horseman's vengeance. The shadow of rivalry also extends beyond Katrina. It reflects the broader anxieties of a society in transition. Ichabod, the outsider with education, represents the new America, mobile, ambitious, individualistic. Brom, rooted in community, strength and tradition, represents the old world transplanted into the new. Their contest is not only personal, but cultural, a struggle between different visions of what America might become. Brom's victory suggests that, at least in Sleepy Hollow, tradition and community still had the upper hand. The outsider's ambition could not overcome the insider's belonging. This is why Brom Bones endures as more than a side character. He is the human counterpart to the Phantom, the rival who gives Ichabod's fear its shape, the trickster who may or may not be the ghost himself. Without Brom, the horseman would lack ambiguity. Without Brom, Ichabod's humiliation would lack context. It is Brom's presence that gives the legend its richness, its tension between the supernatural and the human, between belief and skepticism. And so Brom Bones rides in the story alongside the Phantom, his laughter echoing in the background of the chase, his strength and confidence making Ichabod's fear all the more sharp. Whether or not he was the horseman, he remains inseparable from the legend, the shadow of rivalry that haunts the tale as surely as the gallop of hooves in the night.
Weapons matter in folklore. They are never just tools of violence. They are symbols, extensions of the figure who wields them, carrying meanings that go beyond their physical form. In the case of the Headless Horseman, the weapon is one of the most fascinating details of the legend because it is both terrifying and absurd. In Washington Irving's story, the horseman hurls a pumpkin at Ichabod Crane. In other tellings and depictions, he carries a sword, an axe, or even his own severed head as a weapon. Each version of the weapon reshapes the legend slightly, emphasizing different aspects of the ghost. And yet, whether it is the grim edge of steel or the grotesque grin of a pumpkin, the effect is the same. The weapon makes the horseman unforgettable. The pumpkin is perhaps the most iconic, though it is also the most peculiar. In Irving's tale, the climactic moment comes when Ichabod, racing for the safety of the bridge, looks back and sees the horseman rising in his stirrups. Instead of swinging a blade, the Phantom hurls what appears to be his head, smashing into Ichabod with a force that sends him tumbling. The next day, the villagers find a shattered pumpkin at the site, leaving the story suspended between supernatural horror and human trickery. Was it truly the ghost's head hurled at Ichabod, or was it a prank by Brom Bones, who substituted the pumpkin for a head in order to terrify his rival? This ambiguity is deliberate. The pumpkin is both comical and horrifying. On one hand, it is a fruit of the harvest, an object of abundance, associated with farms, pies, and autumn feasts. On the other, when carved into a jack-o'-lantern, it becomes grotesque, its hollow face grinning with eerie light. The duality of the pumpkin reflects the duality of the story itself. Is it a comic tale of a prank gone too far, or a terrifying account of a ghostly pursuit? The pumpkin sits at the center of this tension, a weapon that is not a weapon, a symbol that is both ridiculous and deadly. The choice of a pumpkin also ties the horseman to American soil. Pumpkins were a staple of colonial farming, abundant in the Hudson Valley. They were practical food, used for everything from soups to desserts. To use such a familiar object as a weapon was to root the ghost in the everyday life of the villagers. Unlike the Dullahan's whip of human spine or the wild huntsman's spectral spear, the American horseman's weapon was a product of the land itself. It was ordinary and extraordinary at once. In this way, the pumpkin localized the legend, giving it a distinctly American flavor. But in other versions of the horseman's story, and in later adaptations, he wields more traditional weapons. The axe is a common choice. Heavy, brutal, and tied to both warfare and execution, the axe carries powerful symbolism. In battle, it is a weapon of raw force, capable of cleaving armor and bone. In execution, it is the tool of beheading, the very instrument that might have separated the horseman from his own head. To imagine him carrying an axe is to see him as both victim and avenger, a ghost who wields the instrument of his own death against others. The axe makes him more overtly violent, less ambiguous, a figure of pure wrath. The sword is another frequent depiction, especially in illustrations that emphasize the horseman's identity as a soldier. A Hessian mercenary would have carried a saber, a curved blade suited to cavalry charges. To give the ghost a sword is to tie him directly to his martial past, to present him as a soldier who continues to fight even after death. The sword emphasizes his role as a remnant of war, a ghost whose violence did not end with the battle. Unlike the pumpkin, which suggests trickery and ambiguity, the sword makes the horseman a figure of grim inevitability, a reminder that war's violence lingers even after peace has supposedly been declared. Some depictions go further, imagining the horseman using his own severed head as a weapon. This detail ties him back to older European traditions, particularly the Irish Dullahan, whose head was sometimes said to glow and whose gaze could strike terror or death. To see the horseman hurl his own head is to confront the grotesque inversion of identity itself. The head, normally the seat of reason and recognition, becomes a projectile, a blunt instrument of fear.
This image is the most disturbing of all because it erases any separation between the ghost's body and his weapon. He becomes entirely self-contained, his very being turned into an instrument of violence. Each of these weapons, the pumpkin, the axe, the sword, the severed head, shapes the way the legend is interpreted. The pumpkin leaves open the question of whether the horseman is real or a trick. The axe emphasizes his brutality and ties him to execution. The sword grounds him in his identity as a soldier, a relic of war. The severed head makes him an impossible monster, a figure of grotesque horror. Together, these variations reveal the flexibility of the legend. The horseman is not fixed. He can be terrifying in different ways depending on what he carries in his hand. Weapons in folklore often carry symbolic weight beyond the immediate. The pumpkin, for example, reflects the harvest season, the turning of the year, the boundary between life and death. Autumn was traditionally the time when the veil between worlds was thought to be thinnest, when spirits walked abroad. To have the horseman appear at harvest time with a pumpkin as his weapon is to tie him directly to this seasonal fear. The axe, on the other hand, recalls not only battle but execution, justice, and punishment. It makes the horseman a judge as well as a killer, an avenger who brings down the blade on those who cross his path. The sword recalls nobility and honor as well as war, linking the ghost to traditions of knightly combat while also marking him as a mercenary, a soldier for hire whose loyalty was to coin rather than cause. The severed head is the most primal symbol of all, representing the loss of self, the destruction of identity, and the triumph of death over life. The villagers of Sleepy Hollow would have understood these symbols intuitively. To hear that the horseman hurled his head was to hear of a ghost unlike any other, a terrifying impossibility. To hear that he wielded a sword was to remember the Hessians who had once ridden through their valley. To hear that he carried an axe was to recall the punishments meted out by authority, the executions that kept order in colonial society. And to hear that he hurled a pumpkin was to laugh and shudder at once, caught between the absurd and the horrifying. The enduring image, however, is the pumpkin. Modern retellings almost always return to it because it is the detail that sets the American horseman apart from his European ancestors. The Dullahan may have carried a whip of spine or hurled his own head. The wild huntsman may have led a host of ghostly riders with weapons of storm and fire, but only the horseman of Sleepy Hollow turns the humble pumpkin into a symbol of terror. That choice, whether Irving's invention or drawn from local tradition, ensured the tale's survival. A sword or an axe would have made the horseman merely another ghostly soldier. A pumpkin made him unique, unforgettable, an icon. The ambiguity of the pumpkin also ensures that the story remains balanced between skepticism and belief. Was Ichabod truly chased by a ghost, or was he the victim of Brom Bones's prank? The pumpkin allows both interpretations to exist side by side. It is supernatural if one believes it was the ghost's head. It is mundane if one believes it was a farm boy's trick. The legend thrives precisely because it refuses to resolve this ambiguity. The pumpkin shatters on the ground, and with it, certainty shatters too. In this way, the horseman's weapon is more than a detail. It is the pivot of the entire legend. It is the object that makes the story what it is, that carries the weight of ambiguity, symbolism, and fear. Whether it is the grinning face of a pumpkin, the gleam of a sword, the weight of an axe, or the grotesque horror of a severed head, the weapon defines the ghost. Without it, he is only a rider. With it, he becomes a legend.
Legends rarely remain fixed to the place where they begin. They grow, they spread, they adapt to new audiences, shifting in detail but keeping their essential core. The tale of the Headless Horseman is no exception. What began as a ghost story whispered in a valley by the Hudson, what was shaped into literature by Washington Irving, did not remain only the property of Sleepy Hollow. It became a story told around campfires, printed in books, performed on stage, illustrated in magazines, and eventually broadcast across the world through film and television. The horseman transformed from a local phantom into a national icon, and then into one of the most recognizable figures in global folklore. The way this transformation happened reveals much about the power of storytelling and the cultural needs of the young United States. When Irving first published his story in the sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon Gent, in 1820, it quickly caught attention on both sides of the Atlantic. American readers recognized the setting, the humor, and the hint of supernatural terror as something new, something rooted in their own land rather than borrowed wholesale from Europe. European readers, particularly in Britain, were intrigued by the American flavor of the tale, the way it blended Old World folklore with New World scenery. The story's success was immediate, and it helped establish Irving as the first American writer to achieve lasting international fame. From the beginning, the horseman's ride was not confined to the valley. It galloped into the imagination of readers far beyond Sleepy Hollow. At first, the story spread in oral form as much as in print. People retold it in their own words, often changing details, embellishing the chase, or inventing their own endings. In an age when literacy was not universal, stories moved easily from book to memory to voice. Children heard the tale from their parents, Travelers told it to strangers by firelight, and communities far from the Hudson Valley adopted it as though it had happened in their own woods. The ambiguity of the horseman, ghost or prankster, allowed the story to fit many contexts. It could be told as a moral lesson about greed, as a spooky tale about restless spirits, or as a comic anecdote about a foolish schoolmaster. Its flexibility made it durable. Illustrations soon followed. In the 19th century, illustrated editions of Irving's works brought the image of the horseman into sharper focus. Artists depicted the climactic chase in dramatic scenes. Ichabod hunched forward on his stumbling horse, the phantom looming behind with raised weapon, the dark woods closing in around them. These images fixed the horseman's appearance in popular imagination. No longer just a figure described in words, he became a visual icon, headless, cloaked, riding a massive black steed with a weapon ready to strike. The image was powerful enough that even those who had never read Irving's story could recognize the ghost. Stage adaptations soon emerged. In the mid-19th century, theaters staged versions of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, often emphasizing the comic elements of Ichabod's character while keeping the chase as the dramatic centerpiece. Theatrical effects, galloping sounds, sudden appearances, hurled pumpkins brought the legend to life in new ways. Audiences thrilled at the sight of the horseman on stage, a figure both terrifying and entertaining. By this point, the ghost was no longer just a literary creation. He was a character in popular entertainment, recognizable and marketable. As America expanded westward, the legend traveled with it. Pioneers carried books and stories with them, and the horsemen rode into frontier settlements as part of the cultural baggage of the young nation. Around campfires in territories far from New York, settlers retold the story, often blending it with local ghost tales. In some places, people even claimed to see headless riders of their own, as if the legend had given shape to anxieties in entirely different landscapes. The horseman became a template for fear, a ready-made figure who could appear wherever the land was dark, the roads lonely, and the past heavy with violence. The story's survival was also aided by its seasonal character. Because it was set in autumn during harvest, with pumpkins and gatherings, it became tied to the season of Halloween. Though Halloween itself did not become widely celebrated in America until the late 19th century, once it did, the headless horseman quickly became associated with the holiday. His image was perfect for October nights, dark, eerie, ambiguous, a mixture of humor and terror. By the 20th century, he was a regular figure in Halloween decorations, costumes, and children's stories, cementing his role as a seasonal icon. Print culture continued to spread the legend. Children's editions of Irving's tale appeared, often simplified, with illustrations that emphasized the chase. These editions introduced new generations to the horseman, ensuring that he remained part of American folklore. At the same time, scholars and folklorists studied the story, tracing its European roots, analyzing its symbolism, and placing it within the larger tradition of ghost stories. This dual life, as both entertainment and subject of study, kept the legend alive in multiple spheres of culture. The invention of film gave the horseman yet another stage. As early as the silent film era, adaptations of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow were produced, though many are now lost. The most famous early cinematic version was Walt Disney's 1949 animated short, The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad, which presented the tale with humor and flair. Disney's version, with its stylized animation and dramatic chase sequence, introduced the horseman to millions of children and cemented his image in American pop culture. The pumpkin became central in this adaptation, hurled with terrifying force as Ichabod fled across the bridge. For many, this was the definitive version of the story, the one that fixed the horseman as both frightening and entertaining. Television and later film adaptations continued to reinvent the legend. Each new version adjusted the details, sometimes making the horseman more terrifying, sometimes giving him a more explicit backstory, sometimes framing him as a tragic figure rather than a mere ghost. In all cases, however, the essential elements remained: the headless rider, the chase through the night, the weapon raised for the final blow. The horseman proved endlessly adaptable, able to fit horror, comedy, romance, or adventure, depending on the needs of the storyteller. This adaptability explains why he never faded. Beyond entertainment, the horseman also entered American cultural identity. He became a symbol of the nation's ability to create its own folklore, its own legends to rival those of Europe. Just as Britain had King Arthur and Robin Hood, just as Ireland had the Dullahan, America had the Headless Horseman. He was a ghost not borrowed directly but transformed, rooted in American soil, tied to the Revolution, the Hudson Valley, and the superstitions of colonial communities. To tell his story was to assert that America had a past rich enough to produce legends of its own. Communities themselves embraced the legend. Sleepy Hollow, once a quiet village, became a destination for those seeking the ghost's home. Festivals, reenactments, and tours celebrated the story, drawing on its power to attract visitors and reinforce local identity. The horseman became not only a figure of fear, but also of pride, a symbol of heritage. This local embrace helped ensure that the legend was not only remembered in books, but lived in practice. What is striking is how the story thrived precisely because of its ambiguity. If the horseman were clearly real or clearly a trick, the legend might have faded as certainty replaced mystery. But because the story never resolved the question, it remained fertile ground for retelling. Each generation could interpret it differently. Some could treat it as a ghost story, others as a comic tale of rivalry. Children could laugh at the pumpkin, while adults could shudder at the thought of a restless soldier haunting the night. This flexibility allowed the legend to grow rather than stagnate. And so the horseman spread from the valley to the nation, from print to stage, from campfires to film screens. He became more than a character in a story. He became an icon, a figure who could ride anywhere fear was needed, anywhere imagination sought a ghost. From humble beginnings in the whispered tales of Sleepy Hollow, he became a national symbol of folklore, an American nightmare recognized around the world. Fear is not only told in words, it is drawn, painted, carved, and etched. The Headless Horseman, though born from oral tradition and preserved by Washington Irving's pen, did not become an enduring cultural icon through text alone. His survival owes as much to the artists who gave him shape as to the storytellers who spoke his name. Visual depictions fixed the ghost in the imagination, capturing the instant of terror, the raised weapon, the galloping horse, the figure without a head. Each generation of artists emphasized different aspects of the legend, some highlighting horror, others leaning into comedy, still others balancing the two. In these depictions, we see how the horseman evolved from a local ghost to one of the most recognizable figures in American folklore. The earliest illustrations of the horseman appeared in editions of The Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon Jentin's Irving's collection that first introduced the tale to a broad audience. These woodcuts and engravings were often crude by modern standards, but they captured the essential drama: Ichabod's frantic flight through the dark woods, his lanky form bent low over his horse, while behind him the looming shape of the horseman pursued, weapon raised. These images emphasized motion and fear. The details of the phantom's costume or the horse's anatomy mattered less than the sense of chase, the feeling that the rider was always just behind, about to strike. Readers who had never seen the Hudson Valley could still imagine the scene vividly because the illustrations gave them a visual anchor. As the 19th century progressed, artists grew more sophisticated, and the horseman took on more defined form. Some depicted him as a soldier dressed in the uniform of a Hessian cavalryman, his headless body upright in the saddle, his cloak billowing in the wind. Others gave him a more spectral appearance, cloaked in shadows, his missing head hidden by darkness, his weapon gleaming unnaturally. These artistic choices shaped how audiences understood the ghost. Was he a revenant soldier, tied to history and war, or was he a supernatural being, a creature of night beyond all explanation? The answer depended on which illustration the viewer encountered. One of the most enduring images is the moment at the bridge. Artists repeatedly returned to it, capturing Ichabod's desperate hope for safety as the phantom raises his arm to hurl the pumpkin. The bridge, narrow and framed by trees, becomes a stage where the climax of the legend always unfolds. In visual form, the ambiguity of the pumpkin becomes more striking. Some artists show it clearly as a pumpkin, grinning and absurd, while others depict it as a grotesque head, its features twisted in horror. The ambiguity of Irving's text thus carries into art, with different illustrators choosing different interpretations. This multiplicity only strengthens the legend, allowing the horseman to remain fluid, shifting between humor and horror depending on the artist's hand. Magazines and illustrated anthologies of the 19th century spread these images widely. In an age when many Americans lived far from theaters or libraries, magazines were often their main connection to literature and art. Seeing the horseman illustrated in such publications gave him national reach, ensuring that his image was not confined to New York, but recognized across the country. The figure of the cloaked, headless rider became familiar even to those who had never read Irving's story. The image carried the tale into households that might never have otherwise encountered it. The horseman also found a place in fine art. Painters of the Romantic period, drawn to themes of the supernatural, the uncanny, and the picturesque, sometimes depicted the chase in dramatic canvases, the dark forests of the Hudson Valley, the flickering lanterns, the spectral rider, all lent themselves to the romantic fascination with terror and beauty intertwined. These paintings were less about the details of the story and more about the mood, the tension between light and shadow, the sense of awe before forces beyond human control. In this way, the horseman entered not only popular culture but also the realm of artistic exploration, part of a larger movement that sought to capture the sublime. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the rise of children's editions of the legend of Sleepy Hollow brought new interpretations. Illustrators softened the terror, presenting Ichabod as more comical and the horseman as more exaggerated. Pumpkins with wide grins replaced grotesque heads, and the chase took on a cartoonish quality. These illustrations introduced the legend to young audiences, ensuring its survival, but they also shifted its tone. For many children, the horseman was less a figure of genuine fear and more a mischievous bogeyman, a story to thrill but not to scar. This tension between horror and humor continued into the 20th century as artists adapted the figure for different audiences. The arrival of film and animation expanded the horseman's visual life. Walt Disney's 1949 adaptation of the story remains one of the most influential visual interpretations. The Disney animators exaggerated Ichabod's lankiness, turned Brom into a caricature of boisterous masculinity, and gave the horseman a dark, shadowy form that loomed larger than life. The climactic chase, with its sweeping camera angles and dramatic lighting, burned the image of the headless rider hurling a flaming pumpkin into the minds of millions. Disney's version set a template that many later artists followed, with the horseman depicted as a towering, cloaked figure, more shadow than substance, terrifying but also theatrical. In comic books, the horseman found yet another home. Horror anthologies of the mid-20th century frequently included adaptations of the Sleepy Hollow story, often emphasizing gore and shock. Here, the horseman might carry a dripping axe, his cloak torn, his horse a skeletal beast. These images leaned into horror, stripping away the humor and ambiguity to present the ghost as a relentless killer. At the same time, lighter comic adaptations presented him as bumbling or exaggerated, a figure of slapstick rather than terror. This versatility shows how the horseman could shift depending on the illustrator's intention. He could be nightmare or parody, grim spectre or Halloween mascot, without ever losing his essential identity. Modern illustration continues this tradition. Contemporary artists depict the horseman in countless ways, sometimes as a spectral soldier, sometimes as a demonic presence, sometimes as a gothic icon of Halloween. Digital art and graphic novels have given him new life, with detailed, atmospheric renditions that emphasize the glowing eyes of his horse, the billowing of his cloak, the eerie emptiness where his head should be. In fan art and popular culture, he appears in endless variations, a figure endlessly reinvented but always recognizable. The persistence of the horseman in art speaks to the power of his image. He is simple enough to be drawn by a child, just a rider, a horse, and an empty space where the head should be. Yet he is complex enough to sustain endless interpretation. Artists return to him because he embodies the perfect balance of familiarity and impossibility. We know what a rider should look like. We know what a face should be. To see those expectations violated is to feel both fascination and fear. What is most striking is how consistent certain elements remain. No matter the medium, the horseman is almost always shown cloaked, mounted on a dark horse, weapon raised, pursuing a victim through a wooded or rural landscape. These details anchor the image across centuries and cultures. The variations, the pumpkin or the sword, the comic or the terrifying, circle around this central core. The horseman is always in motion, always pursuing, always headless. It is this consistency that makes him iconic, as recognizable as Dracula's cape or Frankenstein's bolts. Art does more than depict the legend. It keeps it alive. Each new illustration introduces the horseman to new audiences, shapes their understanding, and ensures his ride continues. From woodcuts in 1820s editions to digital paintings shared online, the Headless Horseman has been seen as often as he has been read. His power lies not only in the words of Washington Irving, but in the countless images that have brought him to life, or more accurately, to unlife. The story of the Headless Horseman may have been born on the page and nurtured in local folklore, but it did not remain there. As entertainment evolved, so too did the ghost. From silent films to streaming series, from Halloween specials to horror anthologies, the horseman has appeared again and again, reinvented for each new generation. Few American legends have proven as adaptable. He can terrify, he can amuse, he can appear as the villain in horror or the mascot of Halloween, but he is always recognizable. His transition from folklore to popular culture is not just a matter of retelling. It is a journey of transformation, where each new medium reshaped his image while keeping his essential terror intact. The earliest cinematic treatments of the legend came in the silent era. Though many of these early films are now lost, records suggest that filmmakers quickly recognized the appeal of Irving's story. The climactic chase lent itself perfectly to the moving image, a desperate rider pursued by a phantom, the tension mounting with each gallop. Silent cinema emphasized visual spectacle, and the Headless Horseman provided exactly that. The absence of a head was in effect both horrifying and fascinating, and filmmakers used costumes and camera tricks to make the ghost appear more convincing. These early attempts may not have survived, but they set a pattern that later adaptations would follow: the chase as centerpiece, the pumpkin as a symbol, the ghost as a visual spectacle. The most famous early adaptation arrived in 1922 with The Headless Horseman, a silent film starring Will Rogers as Ichabod Crane. Rogers, known primarily as a humorist and cowboy, brought his lanky figure and comedic timing to the role, emphasizing Ichabod's awkwardness and vulnerability. The film leaned heavily on atmosphere, with dark, misty sets and eerie lighting to bring the phantom to life. Though it played more as a drama than as outright horror, it established Ichabod and the Horseman as cinematic figures, paving the way for future adaptations. But it was Walt Disney who truly cemented the Horseman's place in American popular culture. In 1949, Disney released The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad, an animated feature pairing two stories, one of which was Irving's legend. The Disney version is still considered by many to be the definitive adaptation. It captured the humor of Ichabod's character, his exaggerated features and gluttony, while also delivering one of the most thrilling chase sequences in animation. The Horseman, cloaked in shadow, wielding a flaming pumpkin, remains one of Disney's most iconic villains, terrifying without uttering a single word. The film's climax, with its dramatic use of color, music and pacing, fixed the Horseman in the imagination of generations of children. For many, this was their first introduction to the legend, and it made an impression strong enough to last a lifetime. Television carried the story further. Throughout the mid-20th century, anthology series like Alcoa presents One Step Beyond and The Wonderful World of Disney occasionally return to the Sleepy Hollow legend, presenting it with varying degrees of horror and humor. In these adaptations, the Horseman often reflected contemporary cultural anxieties. In the post-war years, he could be seen as a reminder of conflict and death, while in lighter children's programming, he became more of a mischievous bogeyman than a true terror. This versatility ensured that he never disappeared, even when horror was not fashionable. The late 20th century brought more ambitious adaptations. In 1980, a television film adaptation starred Jeff Goldblum as Ichabod Crane, giving the character a nervous, eccentric energy that suited the role. This version leaned into the ambiguity of the legend, emphasizing both the possibility of a real ghost and the likelihood of Brom Bones's prank. It was one of many adaptations that sought to modernize the story without losing its original charm. The 1990s saw a surge in interest in gothic and supernatural stories, and the Horseman rode again into the spotlight. One of the most notable appearances was in Tim Burton's 1999 film Sleepy Hollow. Starring Johnny Depp as Ichabod and Christopher Walken as the Horseman, this adaptation reimagined the legend as a full-fledged gothic horror. Burton's vision was darker, bloodier, and more stylized than earlier versions. The Horseman became not just a ghost, but a demonic figure, summoned by witchcraft, his axe dripping with blood, his pursuit relentless and violent. The film abandoned much of Irving's comic tone in favor of gothic spectacle, but it gave the Horseman a new lease on life in popular culture. Burton's Horseman was terrifying, his headless form brought to life with special effects that made him both grotesque and mesmerizing. For many modern viewers, this was the version that defined the character, a figure of pure horror rather than ambiguous folklore. At the same time, lighter adaptations continued to thrive. In 1999, the same year as Burton's film, the animated series Wishbone presented a child-friendly version of the legend of Sleepy Hollow, with the titular dog imagining himself as Ichabod. This duality, the ghost as both horror and humor, shows how adaptable the Horseman remained. He could appear in a bloody gothic film one moment and in a children's show the next, without losing his essential identity. In the 21st century, the Horseman continued to ride across screens. The 2013 television series Sleepy Hollow reimagined the story entirely, blending it with apocalyptic themes, biblical prophecy, and modern police drama. Here, the Horseman became one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, a figure of cosmic significance rather than local folklore. Though the show took considerable liberties with Irving's story, it demonstrated the legend's ability to evolve, to be reinterpreted for entirely new contexts. Audiences who might never have read the original tale were introduced to the horseman as part of a larger mythology, one that blended horror, fantasy, and action. Beyond direct adaptations, the horseman has appeared in countless references, parodies, and homages. Animated shows like Scooby-Doo, The Simpsons, and Courage the Cowardly Dog have all featured headless riders in episodes that draw on the legend. Comic books have reimagined him as both villain and anti-hero, sometimes even as a tragic figure seeking his lost head. Video games have used his image as a boss character or Halloween-themed monster, capitalizing on the visual impact of a headless rider charging with weapon raised. The figure has become so iconic that even when he is detached from the Sleepy Hollow story, audiences recognize him instantly. Halloween cemented his place in popular culture more than any other force. By the late 20th century, the horseman was as much a part of Halloween imagery as witches, ghosts, and jack-o'-lanterns. His silhouette, cloak billowing, pumpkin raised high, appears on decorations, costumes, and advertisements every October. Parades and haunted houses feature him as a centerpiece, galloping through fog on horseback or appearing in animatronic form to startle guests. In this seasonal role, he embodies the balance of fright and fun that defines Halloween, both terrifying and entertaining at once. What is striking is how the horseman thrives across so many modes of storytelling. He can be the villain in a gothic horror film, the punchline in a children's cartoon, the centerpiece of a parade, or the subject of a serious scholarly adaptation. Few figures in folklore achieve such flexibility. Dracula is almost always a vampire. Frankenstein's monster is almost always tragic, but the horseman shifts as needed, his missing head a blank space onto which culture projects its fears and desires. The persistence of the horseman in popular culture also reflects the American desire for homegrown myths. Just as the frontier produced figures like Paul Bunyan and Davy Crockett, Sleepy Hollow produced the horseman. But unlike those figures of expansion and conquest, the horseman represented something darker, the memory of war, the presence of death, the inevitability of fear. Popular culture kept him alive because he filled a space no other figure quite could. He was both European in origin and distinctly American in adaptation, both terrifying and comic, both specific to Sleepy Hollow and universal to anyone who has ever felt fear on a dark road. And so the Headless Horseman continues to ride, not only in books and stories, but across screens and stages, parades and theme parks, Halloween nights and streaming platforms. He is no longer just a phantom of the Hudson Valley, but a citizen of global popular culture, instantly recognized, endlessly reimagined, forever in pursuit. The Headless Horseman is frightening not only because of his supernatural power, not only because of his relentless pursuit, but because he embodies something deeper, something that touches human psychology at its most primal level. The missing head is more than a grotesque detail. It is a direct assault on identity itself. To see a man without a head is to see a human being stripped of the very thing that makes him recognizable, relatable, and comprehensible. In that void where the head should be lies a terror more profound than swords or ghosts. It is the terror of losing the self, of becoming nothing, of annihilation. The human face is the anchor of identity. We recognize one another by our faces. We read emotion, intention, and thought through the eyes, the mouth, the expression of features. Without a face, a person becomes anonymous, unknowable, alien. A headless body strips away communication and individuality. What remains is an object in motion, something that looks human but is not fully human. Psychologists often describe this as uncanny, the unsettling strangeness that arises when something familiar is rendered unfamiliar. A man on horseback is ordinary. A man on horseback without a head is monstrous. The ordinary becomes twisted into horror by the removal of the one feature we rely on most to connect to others. This is why headlessness recurs in nightmares and folklore across cultures. It speaks to a deep-seated fear of being erased, of having one's essence stolen or destroyed. The head represents not only identity, but also control. It houses the brain, the seat of thought and reason. To lose the head is to lose the capacity for choice, for agency, for free will. A headless rider is a body reduced to pure motion, driven by instinct or curse rather than reason. He pursues without pause, without negotiation, without mercy. He embodies action stripped of humanity. This makes him terrifying because he cannot be reasoned with. He is a force, not a person. The fear of losing the head is also tied to mortality. Death severs us from the world, but decapitation dramatizes that severance with brutal clarity. It is one of the most violent and irreversible of deaths, leaving the body visibly incomplete. In ancient cultures, to lose one's head was to lose one's soul, one's ability to move into the afterlife. It represented dishonor, disgrace, and eternal unrest. To imagine such a figure returning as a ghost is to imagine death itself given form, a death that denies closure, a death that remains restless and incomplete. In psychological terms, the headless rider forces us to confront annihilation anxiety, the fear that the self will not simply die but vanish, erased from recognition, memory, and continuity. A ghost with a face can still be remembered, identified, pitied, or feared. A ghost without a face cannot.
He is nameless, identity stripped away, reduced to a symbol of the void. This void is projected outward in the chase. The horseman pursues the living not only to terrify them, but to pull them toward his own annihilation, to make them like him, headless, faceless, erased. Ichabod Crane's terror reflects this psychology. As he flees, he is not only afraid of being struck down, but of being unmade. The thought of the horseman hurling a pumpkin or a head at him is not only the fear of physical injury, but the fear of losing his own identity. The pumpkin's grin mocks him, replacing his humanity with absurdity. The missing head of the rider reflects back to Ichabod his own potential fate, that he too might vanish, erased from the community, from memory, from existence. His disappearance at the end of the story is the realization of this fear. Whether carried off by a ghost or fleeing in humiliation, he ceases to exist within Sleepy Hollow. He is, in effect, annihilated, his identity erased, just as the horseman's was. The horseman's psychology can also be understood as the embodiment of trauma. He is the soldier killed violently, denied burial, his identity erased by war. In returning as a ghost, he externalizes the trauma of violent death. His missing head is the scar of battle, his endless riding the symptom of unrest. For the living, he is the projection of their own anxieties about war, death, and the fragility of life. Communities haunted by memories of conflict see in him the personification of unresolved grief. His lack of a head is not only grotesque, but symbolic of lives lost too quickly, without remembrance, without closure. The fascination with the horseman in popular culture can also be explained psychologically. He allows audiences to engage with annihilation anxiety in a safe way. To watch him chase Ichabod, to see him hurl a pumpkin, to encounter him in a Halloween parade, is to experience fear in controlled form. The story gives shape to the inchoate dread of losing the self, presenting it as a chase one can watch from the outside. This catharsis, this safe engagement with fear, is part of what makes the legend so enduring. The horseman also embodies the fear of the other. His missing head marks him as foreign, alien, outside the bounds of normal humanity. In Irving's tale, he is specifically a Hessian, a German soldier, a foreign mercenary. His headlessness, then, becomes a symbol of his lack of belonging. He is both foreigner and ghost, doubly alien. Psychologically, he represents the fear of outsiders, the anxiety that what is strange or different will intrude upon the community. To be chased by him is to be pursued by that fear, to feel the pressure of the unknown bearing down. At the same time, the horseman can be read as the dark double of Ichabod. Both are outsiders, both are marked by difference, both are defined by what they lack.
Ichabod lacks strength, belonging, and stability. The horseman lacks a head, a face, a self. Their chase is a psychological mirror, with Ichabod pursued by the embodiment of his own deepest insecurities. The horseman strips him of what little identity he has, erasing him from Sleepy Hollow, just as his own head was erased from his body. The psychology of the headless also connects to broader themes of dehumanization. In moments of violence, warfare, or oppression, the enemy is often depicted as faceless, stripped of individuality. The horseman is the ultimate version of this. He is literally faceless, reduced to a symbol of fear. To confront him is to confront the process of dehumanization itself, the stripping away of personhood. This resonates because it touches on a universal fear, that we might not be remembered as ourselves, that we might become anonymous, erased, forgotten. Even the comic elements of the horseman's weapon, such as the pumpkin, play into this psychology. The pumpkin, carved into a grinning face, is a parody of identity, a false face that mocks the idea of individuality. It is a grotesque stand-in for the human head, a reminder that once identity is gone, it can be replaced by absurdity. To be struck by a pumpkin is not only to be humiliated, but to be mocked by a false version of humanity. The weapon reinforces the fear of being erased, replaced, rendered ridiculous in place of remembered. In dreams and nightmares, headlessness often symbolizes disempowerment, loss of control, or overwhelming anxiety. Dream analysts often interpret such imagery as reflecting feelings of powerlessness or the fear of losing one's sense of self. The horseman embodies this archetype perfectly. He is not just a dream figure, but a cultural nightmare made flesh. He taps into the same deep fears that appear in personal subconscious visions, giving them communal form. Ultimately, the psychology of the headless is about annihilation, not only death, but erasure. To die with recognition is one thing, to vanish without identity is another. The headless horseman embodies this deeper fear. He is not only a ghost, but the absence of self, a figure who pursues the living in order to remind them that they too can lose not only their lives, but their faces, their names, their place in memory. This is why he endures. He is not simply frightening in the moment. He is frightening because he represents the ultimate fear that we will cease to exist, not only in body but in identity, erased as though we never were. The Headless Horseman began as a story tied to a single place. He haunted the valley of the Hudson, the lanes of Sleepy Hollow, the bridge over the stream where Ichabod Crane met his fate. Yet the figure did not remain confined to that geography. Over time he grew beyond it, becoming not only a ghost of a community, but an icon recognized across the world. His power endures because he is more than a phantom of one village. He is the embodiment of something larger, a fear and fascination that transcends borders, centuries, and cultures. To understand his endurance, one must see how a local tale became a global nightmare. The first step in that endurance was Washington Irving himself. By placing the horseman within a written tale, Irving ensured that he could not vanish as many oral legends do. His prose captured the atmosphere of the Hudson Valley, the humor of Ichabod, the terror of the chase, and the ambiguity of the pumpkin. Once fixed in print, the horseman was no longer just a story told by neighbors around a hearth. He was a character in literature, accessible to readers far from New York. Irving's international reputation carried him to Europe, and with him, the horseman rode across the Atlantic, introducing foreign audiences to America's own brand of folklore. Yet the tale did not remain locked on the page. Communities retold it orally, adjusting the details to fit their own landscapes. Farmers in Pennsylvania or Ohio might imagine a headless rider galloping through their own woods, just as villagers in New England might see him as haunting their roads. The story travelled because it resonated. It did not depend on Sleepy Hollow's geography alone, but on universal fears of restless spirits, violent death, and the pursuit of the living by the dead. This universality made it easy for the horseman to become a legend not just of one place, but of many. As America developed its national identity in the 19th century, the horseman played a symbolic role. He was a distinctly American ghost, tied to the Revolutionary War and the folklore of the Hudson Valley. In a young nation eager to prove that it had cultural depth equal to Europe, the horseman provided proof that America had its own legends. He stood alongside figures like Rip Van Winkle, another creation of Irving, as evidence that the new world could generate myths as enduring as the old. The endurance of the horseman, then, was partly national pride, a cultural anchor that gave America its own supernatural heritage. The horseman's endurance also lies in his adaptability. Unlike some figures of folklore who are bound tightly to specific rules, he is flexible. He can be terrifying or comic, historical or supernatural, tragic or absurd. His weapon can be a sword, an axe, a head, or a pumpkin. His motive can be vengeance, curse, or prank. This adaptability allows him to shift across genres, audiences, and generations. Children can encounter him in cartoons without being scarred, while adults can watch him in horror films and still feel genuine fear. He is not one story, but many, not one ghost, but a family of interpretations orbiting the same core image, the headless rider in pursuit. Globally, the horseman resonates because he connects with older traditions of headless phantoms. European immigrants recognized echoes of the Dullahan and the wild huntsman in his form. Readers in other countries found in him parallels to their own local legends of restless spirits. This recognition made him familiar even when he was new. A German reader could see in him a cousin of the wild huntsman. An Irish reader could see the shadow of the Dullahan. The horseman thus bridged old world fears with new world identity, making him a legend who belonged everywhere. The endurance of the horseman is also tied to imagery. Words alone could not have kept him alive. The countless illustrations, paintings, and later films ensured that his image was burned into cultural memory. The cloaked rider, the missing head, the weapon raised. These elements are instantly recognizable, even without the story. Visual culture made him immortal. He could be drawn in children's books, painted on Halloween decorations, or animated in films, and each time, audiences recognized him instantly. His silhouette alone is enough to conjure the entire legend. Few figures in folklore achieve this level of iconicity. Psychologically, his endurance can be explained by the fears he embodies. He is the terror of being pursued, the fear of losing identity, the horror of death without rest. These fears are not tied to one culture or time. They are universal. As long as people fear the dark, fear death, and fear being erased, the horseman will remain relevant. He gives shape to dread in a way that is both immediate and symbolic. His missing head is not only grotesque but profoundly meaningful, representing the loss of self that every human being dreads. In this way, he endures because he reflects something fundamental about the human condition. The globalization of the horseman accelerated in the 20th century when mass media carried him into households across the world. Disney's adaptation introduced him to millions of children who might never have read Irving's text. Tim Burton's Sleepy Hollow reintroduced him as a figure of gothic horror to international audiences. Television series, comic books, and video games carried him further, sometimes detaching him from Irving's story entirely. In Japan, he appeared as a character in anime. In Europe, he was absorbed into Halloween imagery that had spread globally. Today, he is as likely to be recognized in London, Tokyo, or Sydney as in New York. He is no longer just an American ghost. but a global figure. Festivals and tourism have also played a role. Sleepy Hollow itself has embraced the horseman, turning its legend into a cultural and economic resource. Tourists visit to see the old Dutch church, the burial ground, and the streets said to be haunted. Festivals in October feature reenactments, parades, and performances where the horseman gallops through the night. These events keep the legend alive not only for locals, but for visitors from around the world. The ghost has become both folklore and industry, a figure who rides not only in stories, but in the economy of cultural memory. The endurance of the horseman is also helped by his ambiguity. Unlike Dracula, who must drink blood, or Frankenstein's monster, who is a tragic creation, the horseman has no fixed rules. He can be a ghost searching for his head, a cursed soldier, a prankster in disguise, or an avenger summoned by witchcraft. Each version leaves enough mystery to keep audiences guessing. The lack of resolution in Irving's original tale, was it a ghost or was it Brom Bones, sets the tone for all future retellings. The horseman never becomes stale because he is never fully defined. He is always partly unknown, always open to reinterpretation. This openness ensures his future. New storytellers can adapt him to new anxieties. In times of war, he can be a symbol of soldiers who do not rest. In times of cultural tension, he can represent the outsider or the foreigner. In times of psychological exploration, he can embody the fear of losing self and identity. His headlessness makes him a blank canvas, a figure onto which each generation projects its own fears. That is the secret of his endurance. He is specific enough to be recognizable, but vague enough to be endlessly adaptable. Even as technology advances and entertainment changes, the horseman thrives. In the age of digital art, social media, and streaming, he appears in memes, fan art, and new adaptations. His image circulates in forms that Irving could never have imagined, yet the essence remains. He still rides through the night, still pursues the living, still terrifies and fascinates. His endurance is proof that some figures of folklore tap into something so universal that they can never fade. From local tale to national legend, from national legend to global nightmare, the horseman's ride has never ended. He endures because he embodies fear in its purest form, because he adapts to new contexts without losing his core, because he is both specific and universal, comic and terrifying, American and global. His power lies not only in the story Irving wrote, but in the countless ways that story has been retold, reimagined, and re-illustrated. Each retelling renews him, each image reinscribes him, each adaptation gives him another chance to ride. He is not just a ghost of Sleepy Hollow, he is the enduring rider of fear itself, and as long as people fear the dark, the unknown, and the loss of self, he will never stop pursuing. The Headless Horseman has galloped across centuries, not just because he frightens, but because he challenges. He is not only a figure of pursuit, but a question made flesh. Why do we chase fear? Why do we return to it? Why do we ride into the dark when we know what waits there? Legends survive not merely because they entertain, but because they force us to face something about ourselves. The horseman, in all his variations, is more than a ghost story. He is a mirror, a dare, a reminder that human beings are drawn again and again to confront the very things they claim to avoid. His challenge is simple but profound: to understand why we keep following him into the night. Part of the answer lies in the human relationship with fear. Fear is not only an emotion, but a survival mechanism hardwired into our bodies. It sharpens senses, quickens the heart, prepares us to fight or flee. But beyond its biological function, fear has always been a source of fascination. We tell stories of monsters and ghosts not only to warn, but to thrill. The adrenaline rush of controlled fear is pleasurable in a way that real danger is not. To hear of Ichabod fleeing through the night, to imagine the pounding hooves behind him, is to feel fear without risk. The legend becomes a safe container for dread, allowing people to explore their anxieties in a form that ends when the story ends. The horseman challenges us by embodying the fear we both dread and crave. Another part of the challenge is symbolic. The horseman is not only frightening because of his missing head, but because of what that absence represents. He forces us to confront questions of identity, mortality, and meaning. Who are we without our faces, our names, our recognition? What happens to us when we die violently, forgotten, unburied? The horseman embodies these questions, riding into our imagination as a reminder that death is not only an end, but an uncertainty. To encounter him is to be asked, how will you be remembered? What will remain of you when the head is gone, when the face that others knew is erased? His challenge is existential, pushing us to face the annihilation we prefer not to consider. The horseman also challenges us socially. In Irving's tale, he is the figure who exposes the weaknesses of Ichabod Crane, who humbles the outsider, who reaches too far. In this sense, the horseman becomes a test of belonging, a ghost who reveals who fits into a community and who does not. Ichabod's flight and disappearance are not only a matter of supernatural terror, but a social judgment. The community of Sleepy Hollow remains intact. The outsider is cast out. The horseman challenges us to consider how communities define themselves, how they treat those who do not belong, how legends become tools of inclusion and exclusion. His pursuit is not only personal but cultural, chasing out those who threaten the balance. In modern times, the challenge has shifted but not disappeared. Today, the horseman appears in films, shows, and festivals not only to scare, but to invite us to engage with fear more consciously. Audiences buy tickets to haunted houses where actors dressed as the horseman gallop past, or they watch horror films that reimagine him with blood and fire. In these moments, the challenge is self-imposed. We know what we are seeking. We are riding into the dark willingly because we want to feel what Ichabod felt without paying the same price. The horseman challenges us to explore the line between fear and entertainment, between dread and delight. His endurance also lies in the way he forces us to wrestle with ambiguity. Was he a real ghost, or Brom Bones in disguise? Is he a restless soldier or a demonic force? Each version of the legend leaves questions unanswered. The challenge, then, is to live with uncertainty, to accept that some stories do not resolve neatly, that some fears cannot be explained away. This is perhaps the most difficult challenge of all, because human beings crave certainty. We want to know whether the horseman is real or fake, whether Ichabod was taken or fled. But the legend denies us closure. The horseman rides on because he embodies ambiguity itself, the challenge of facing what cannot be fully known. There is also the challenge of inheritance. Each generation retells the story, reshaping the horseman for its own anxieties. In doing so, we keep him alive, but we also take responsibility for what he represents. By carving pumpkins with grins, by dressing as headless riders on Halloween, by staging reenactments in Sleepy Hollow, we choose to participate in the challenge. We invite the horseman back each year, knowing what he brings. His ride becomes a ritual, a cycle of fear and fascination that we willingly continue. The challenge is not only his pursuit of us, but our pursuit of him, our decision to keep calling him back. Psychologically, the horseman challenges us to confront the inevitability of pursuit itself. We are all, in some sense, Ichabod Crane, hearing the hooves behind us, knowing that something relentless is following. For some, it is the memory of trauma. For others, it is the pressure of mortality, the knowledge that death pursues us whether we acknowledge it or not. The horseman externalizes that pursuit, giving it form, speed, and sound. He challenges us by refusing to stop, by reminding us that what pursues us in life cannot be ignored forever. The chase is always on, whether we face it or flee from it. On a cultural level, the horseman also challenges us to consider the darker parts of history. He is tied to war, to violence, to the fate of mercenaries who died far from home. His legend is a reminder that history is not only victory and triumph, but also blood and loss. By keeping him alive, we acknowledge the unfinished business of the past, the traumas that do not vanish even when wars end. He challenges us to remember what we might prefer to forget, that death leaves scars, that violence lingers, that ghosts ride because something in history has not yet rested. The horseman's challenge is therefore multi-layered. He dares us to face fear, to confront annihilation, to live with ambiguity, to remember history, and to participate willingly in the cycle of retelling. His endurance is not just a matter of entertainment, but of psychology and culture. He survives because we accept his challenge again and again, each time we tell his story, each time we carve his pumpkin, each time we imagine hooves in the night. In this sense, the horseman is not only a ghost of Sleepy Hollow, but a ritual figure, a myth we keep alive because he gives us a way to grapple with what lies beyond ordinary life. He is not just about Ichabod's chase, but about ours, our chase after meaning, our flight from mortality, our endless ride into uncertainty. He endures because his challenge is never finished. As long as people fear the dark, he will be there, waiting to pursue. And as long as people tell stories, we will continue to follow him, testing ourselves against the terror he represents, riding into the dark to see if we can emerge on the other side.